morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to day 2 of the Australian Wind Energy Conference for 2021. It is wonderful to see so many people here in person, particularly in light of the year or two that we've all had. For those that are joining for their second day, I hope your exuberance in catching up with old friends and making new acquaintances yesterday didn't get the better of you. And for those that are joining for the first time today, welcome. I hope that you're going to enjoy this conference. My name is Andrea Gaffney and I am the Net Zero lead at Mott MacDonald across the Asia Pacific region. And I'm delighted to be chairing today's session to make sure that things go according to plan. So before we get underway, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we are gathered here today, the Wambatjok people. And I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So what have we got in store for you today? Well, firstly, there is an exhibition space just near the registration booth. So if you haven't already popped in and gone and seen some of the exhibitors, I would encourage you to do so. There's around about 20 organisations down there that are showcasing their wares, and I'm sure they'd be delighted to meet up with you and have a bit of a conversation. The second thing we have, of course, is a fantastic array of speakers, moderators and panellists that are going to share with us their insights and knowledge over the course of today. We also have 3 keynote speakers. We have Casper Frost Thorage from Star of the South. We have Matthew Gurner from Momentous, and we also have Simon Preston from Althead Industries. And these people combined all represent the intelligence of this industry across the energy ecosystem and the wind industry in particular. And I'm really excited to hear what they've got to say with us today. But before I introduce the moderator for our first session, I'd just like to thank you all for turning up today. I know that it probably would have been a lot easier to have sat at home in our work office, perhaps in our tracksuit pants, or indeed actually gone into the office. But, you know, this is an industry that is very much characterised by its resilience, characterised by its reliability, its sustainability, agility, and of course, flexibility. And these are personality traits that have made up this industry for the better part of the last 3 decades. And as we look towards the middle of the century, when we want to have decarbonised our energy system, we're going to need to draw strength on those character traits. As we rebuild our entire energy system here in Australia and indeed across the world, to make it one that is far more decarbonised, digitised and democratised, making sure that we have the abundance of renewable energy supplying all of our needs in terms of electrification as we increasingly electrify our transport systems and of course our heating systems. I think it's really important that we think about those character traits because according to the ANU, between now and 2030, if we want to halve our emissions here in Australia, we're going to need to be deploying by 2030 double the rate of gigawatts we're installing today. Instead of it being 7 gigawatts, which is what it is today, we're going to need to be installing 15 gigawatts by the year 2030 in order to halve our emissions. So there's going to be an abundance of opportunity and there will possibly be some things that just simply don't go to plan. So make sure that you all continue to build strength in your resilience, reliability, sustainability and agility as we move into the future. So enough lecturing from me. Let me now introduce the moderator for our first session, Marilyn Christizas. She's going to be moderating Mitigating the Risks of Wind Farm Projects from a Financial Perspective. Marilyn is the Director of Renewable Energy Insights. She has over 10 years experience in state government policy in the energy and natural resources portfolio, and has helped Victoria here transition to a cleaner energy supply by helping to establish the renewable energy targets and also designing the Victorian auction scheme. Marilyn currently supports the Clean Energy Investor Group as Policy Director and is presently helping a number of local governments progress their solar farm projects. She's also been working in the Victorian Treasury and has a Master of Economics, International Finance and a graduate diploma in Asian Studies. So over to you, Marilyn. Welcome.
Good morning, and thank you, Andrea, for the very kind introduction. So today we have a very interesting panel and a very experienced panel with us. I might actually ask the panelists to come up on stage. We're going to do things a little bit differently. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and at the same time present their top risk, the top risk they see with wind farm projects. So we might let them sit down. While they sit down, I would like to point out that one of our panelists, James Arthur, unfortunately cannot join us this morning. And Nick Cowling was also an apology, and one of his colleagues, Ian Melwish, is joining us virtually. I'm not sure if we can see Ian on one of the screens, perhaps. Great. Well, good morning, Ian. We might actually start with you. Could you please just quickly introduce yourself and just give us your top risk in the market at this stage?
Thank you. Ian Melwish. I am head of the debt capital markets team at Macquarie Capital for Australia and New Zealand. Our role there is to assist investors raising debt financing for projects, both greenfield and acquisitions as well. We also take on that role for ourselves as a developer. Macquarie is known as obviously a developer of our own projects, and that's part of the role that we undertake for both our internal ourselves as well as for external clients. Maybe coming to risk profile then. Interesting. I think if I had sort of one risk to name, it's probably actually that we get, it's probably a little counterintuitive, is actually having policy certainty. There's been obviously a period now where there's been obviously some uncertainty around sort of policy, but I think there is a risk that if policy settings are developed around less economic aims and more political aims, that that could have an impact on the attractiveness of particularly sort of new investment coming into this part of the market.
Great. Well, that's a great risk, and we'll certainly be talking about that. I fully agree with you. So I might now ask Ali to introduce himself.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here this morning. I cover the infrastructure, energy and utilities team, and energy is a big part of that. So NAB is proud to finance a lot of the wind farms, solar farms across the country. And I'll say energy is quite an important asset class for us. I think it'll be remiss of me not to mention that recently we completed 150 deals globally and have committed over 11.5 billion in the sector. So it's 26 gigawatts of projects. To put that into context, it's enough to power all Australian homes, something that we're very proud of. I think to Ian's point, I fully agree with what Ian's saying in terms of policy certainty. When you look at the last 10 years, 15 years, there's been so many changes. And for investors from equity to debt that are taking 20, 30-year views on assets, you can't have so many cut and changes based on politics rather than good policy. So I echo what Ian's saying.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ali. Nick Keys.
Hi, Nick Keys from Partners Group. Many might not know Partners Group. We're a Swiss-based private markets investor. We're very big in the renewable space, both globally and here in Australia. We're currently completing our 6th utility scale wind farm here. When that's done in the middle of next year, we'll have 1.3 gigs of operating wind farm capacity, but more importantly, through our CWP portfolio, we'll have another 3.5 gigs of really addressable development opportunity. So we're really excited about that. and notwithstanding, going back to the risks we talked about, and absolutely agree with the previous two on policy, our new sites and existing sites, in good locations, near transmission network, but I think the transmission networks and the grid and connection to the grid and potential future curtailment, we'll talk about it in depth here this morning, but that's the number one risk for myself.
Thank you, Nick. Andrew?
Thanks, Marilyn, and thanks for the opportunity today. I'm Andrew Gardner, and I work with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is essentially Australia's green bank. We tend to focus, and I suppose I look after our wind business and have for a number of years now, and tend to focus on helping address market failures. So historically, we've been working heavily to progress bringing different technologies together, whether that's wind and solar and battery, wind and battery, etc. But also looking to support what we call the bridge to contracting. So essentially being able to start fully merchant to support people getting contracts in an orderly, offtake contracts in an orderly fashion over time. I think that'll become increasingly important as you'll see different buckets, I suppose, with different counterparties. In terms of risks, I might stay away from the policy one. I think from a project perspective, connection is where we tend to see a number of or some angst. I think it's fair to say, whether it's once the stuff's in the ground and then leading up to it. So and also the cost of doing a lot of the grid related things. So one of the things we're also looking at is supporting developers, early stage developers, with sort of sharing some of that cost burden to support getting projects into the system from a DA perspective, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your introductions, and certainly all the risks that you've mentioned we'll be covering today. So that's a great start. I might start with a question to Nick. So every couple of years, AEMO, the market operators, prepares a integrated system plan that tells us where the least cost generation will be located and what transmission upgrades we need to deliver those renewables. The Energy Security Board has also put in place some processes to speed up the process of building transmission. So Nick, what do you think are the risks of delays around those transmission upgrades in terms of unlocking renewables? How do you mitigate those risks? What about the lack of contestability in the transmission space around procurement, investment, financing, etc.? Could you please share your thoughts on that?
So let's be clear and step back. There's been a lot of new frameworks released, discussion points, policy, all these things in terms of how we will build out the network. So that's great in terms of we've got structure to it, but at the same time, and then there's increased transparency, which is great, but we have to get across all of these new developments. So us as debt and equity and all our advisors have to spend time. So on the counter side, that means there's delays. As we all tool up, understand it, there will be a number of false starts as new policies and we implemented, and we have to get our bearings reset. So that's good. I think the second bit is a lot of these new frameworks are all around the initial part of a project. So how do you engage on RTs, returns? How do you then do stakeholder engagement, which is all great, but it takes, there's a number of years just to the point where you actually turn a sod in the ground. And so for these networks, then you then need to think about all the build process. So I think we've established the first one, which is good. We've got some structure there. We then need to think about our risks of when we start to build the projects, the number of linesmen we've got in the country, how that will be developed. And there's a number of large-scale projects that are going to be happening simultaneously. So, we need to think about that as delays. So I think there will be delays in it. I would like to see greater contestability in various states. We look at each of our named states, one transmission operator in there working with AEMO and the AER to get projects up. I'd like to be able to see people go across the border more and do that, because so we can solve both of those two pinch points. In terms of how do we address delays, we factor it into our business cases. We know now that we should expect connection delays. We know that whole point testing will take longer than it took for our first generation projects, and all of that needs to be factored into our underlying models and returns. Ideally, though, we would like to see AMO resourced more fully. It's a tough time, and they are a key stakeholder here, and the more support that we can give them, and I mean, they take a bashing in the local media stuff. I really would like to see them have the resources, new people. We're breaking new ground. Help them, and they will help us to get the projects away quicker. We need it because we just have to do this transition a lot faster than we're doing it, because there is a ticking time on there in terms of the coal being taken out of the market, and we need to be ready.
And does that have any implications, say, if your wind project had a PPA and therefore you're locked into some contractual terms and the transmission is not arriving quickly enough for you to dispatch your output?
Yeah,
there
absolutely.
Are other
I think,
implications too.
We're definitely seeing that, sunset dates with things in contracts and in your SFA arrangement with your lenders and with your off-taker. It was something, 6 months or 9 months post your COD date, and it was in the contract, but no one really focused on it. We've seen a number of projects in recent years where there's a lot of focus on sunset dates and what's the right time. But I think it now then, what does that mean? That there's a bifurcation in the market between single asset projects and platform projects. So single asset's great, you've got a one project, but if that project is delayed for any one reason, those dates become really applicable and they're focused. I'll also talk about, we've got the CWP platform in our portfolio, where we've got a number of projects that are existing. So we have an existing project that's operational, but we probably only contracted 70 or 80%. And what we do then is when we do our next project, obviously we've got sunset dates in there, but if for whatever reason it is delayed, and increasingly, as I said, we're seeing it delayed, we don't have that pressure of those sunset dates, because what we will say to the off-taker, hey, we can deliver you your electrons and your green credits from our existing projects, that merchant component, and take that risk off the table. And a lot of our customers, specifically the C&I customers that are signing up to the new PPAs, are seeing real value in that. And that's becoming a real differentiator for us, because if you're thinking about a board who's made representations at their AGMs about their green credentials and 2025 targets, they will be judged on those promises they make. And it won't just be the small retail shareholders, it will be the BlackRocks of this world that are holding them to account. So de-risking projects from those type of delays is a key differentiator.
That's great to see that you're agile and innovative. Excellent. So our next topic, the next risk I want to discuss is marginal loss factors. So a couple of years ago, you might all recall that Adani Renewables put forward a rule change with the AEMC, the Energy Market Commission, to change how the marginal loss factors are calculated. That proposal was rejected by the AEMC. However, the feedback from a lot of wind and solar developers is that MLFs are still very volatile. They're very difficult to forecast. And perhaps most importantly, it's very difficult to hedge against that risk. The risk that your revenue will be very unpredictable and volatile. So I might ask Andrew, and then we'll go to Ian virtually. How material is this risk for the projects that you look at? How does it affect your assessments of those projects? And what are your mitigation strategies, or how do you consider that risk?
Yes, thank you. And obviously, MLF continues to be a key area of due diligence and focus for projects, for new greenfield projects. I think that what has changed over the past few years is a greater focus on the underlying modelling behind the marginal loss factors, and there are a number of key assumptions which can materially impact the results of the modelling. So it's the build out assumptions or new capacity, and it's a question of where and what and how much and what type, but also some assumptions around things like coal closures and so we'll find that and also obviously grid augmentation and expectations around grid augmentation. So financiers, whether we're on the debt or the equity side, will really hone into those assumptions. Particularly build out, I would say, and you'll find at the moment that the the approach is probably one with a little bit more pessimism than optimism. So when it comes to build out assumptions, you'll assume a lot now. I mean, there's certainly a lot of momentum, and certainly a number of the state targets you'll start to fully bake into the assumptions. I think an increasing and a little bit related to MLF and grid is clearly the congestion side of things. So importantly, we see that importantly that people are doing congestion studies, whereas previously they were relatively unheard of through the consultants. So we always will, well, generally speaking, we'll seek congestion analysis to understand really more about not only you know the locational side, but also once it's in, I mean, what are the prospects and what are the sensitivities around what could happen and the consequent results in the modelling. So we're seeing firstly more in-depth modelling or focus on the assumptions behind the modelling. Sensitivity analysis is becoming more congestion analysis. And in terms of mitigants, well, connecting to a good line near a load centre sounds easy, but you know, invariably you see that sort of those related projects tend to have less volatility in their MLFs, and so we are obviously favourably disposed to looking at those, and obviously are more sensitive to projects that are far away from load and connect into you know, weak areas of the grid.
Thanks for sharing your thoughts, Andrew. We might turn to Ian on this topic.
Yeah, well, MLF, I might, I was just sort of thinking as Andrew was talking through that before, and one of the first wind projects I recall doing was actually with Partners Group and actually with CFC almost 10 years ago. And at the time, we spent an enormous amount of discussion around break-even pricing and counterparty risk in construction, and I can't recall much time actually being spent on MLF at all, or transmission. It was sort of almost a done, a tick the box that's done. There's no sort of risk moving forward. And then I think over the last few years, you know, if we're going into our investment committees to discuss, you know, sort of projects, you know, the top 2 or 3 issues really are, you know, what is MLF? You know, have we done the work? To Andrew's point, you know, have we done the diligence? Have we looked at, you know, what could actually happen along this line, both from you know, new projects perspectives and augmentation perspective as well. And you know, we a lot of time we are challenged by our investment and risk colleagues to ensure that, you know, we have done the work, we have, you know, a rigorous base case that we can defend around, you know, what the potential outcomes could be for the investment. Because I think to come to that mitigation question, it is very hard to mitigate. You know, the basis of a project will be where the project is. If you don't understand, you know, the dynamics around what's happening in that sort of local area, then, you know, it's very hard to sort of mitigate that. So it's not I shouldn't say it's a black and white issue, but if you've done the work and you've structured appropriately and the right risk premium for what you're investing in, I think that's really the best mitigation you can have against sort of a future detrimental outcome.
Thanks, Ian. Well, great to see that you're both taking similar approaches to a certain extent and going into a lot more depth in your modelling and your studies. The next topic I want to discuss is one that you raised earlier, Andrew, around connection and commissioning issues. So we know that a lot of the projects have been delayed in terms of connecting to the grid and going through the commissioning process. An unfortunate example of that was the Western Murray Zone, where we've seen AEMO actually a few months ago effectively call out the area as full because there's not enough capacity to connect. So we know that AEMO since then has started a process called the Connections Reform Initiative. So I might ask Ali what his thoughts are around perhaps that Connections Reform Initiative, any feedback on that, but more broadly, how do you approach connection and commissioning issues? How do you mitigate that risk?
Sure.
What's your approach?
Marilyn, I think when we speak to a lot of developers, you know, the 2 risks that come to mind and top risks are really around grid issues. So from commissioning to curtailment, as Ian and Andrew mentioned in the other PPAs. On connection and commissioning, I mean, we've come such a long way. I mean, at NAB, we're fortunate to have a technical services group in the team. So we've got an engineer to navigate all the activities. But to Ian's point, doing a lot of that research up front. So, you know, the risk of, you know, not doing the right modelling or enough modelling at the outset, so you don't get, you know, caught out from, you know, your R0 testing modelling to the registration point is really fundamental. And when people are investing and all those investment decisions have been made, the last thing you want is, you know, for another you know, X number of millions being spent on additional system strength, you know, syncons and whatnot down the track. So what we're finding that the front end modelling is paramount, and I think, you know, the banking community is getting very familiar with 534A letters. What's a clean letter? What's not a clean letter? Is the FIA required or not? So that level of complexity, where I'd say 3 or 4 years ago, and I see Ian sort of nodding, you know, we would have sort of just ticked the connection agreement and we would have moved on with similar to the MLF, but it's so front of mind. The other element is around the EPC. I think similarly, the EPC was, you know, the risk allocation was simply taken by the EPC provider. Now it's such a bespoke set of, you know, grid allocation. The OEM might take risk to a certain amount, and then it flips to a project risk. You know, you could have split contracts. So it's come a long way in that regards. The way we look at it is looking at sort of who are the people doing it? What's their track record and reputation in the sector? And because we've at NAB, we've invested in a lot of projects, you sort of see where some of the pitfalls might be. And I think that reputation and deliverability is probably front of mind. I think on your point around CRI, I mean, we're not sort of at the coalface as some of the other panelists, but, you know, it's great that the CEC, AEMO, all the key stakeholders trying to, you know, solve from a practical sense, some of these issues. That's certainly positive for the industry.
Indeed, and hopefully we get to see the results of their work shortly, probably before Christmas, like every other report that seems to be coming out. Andrew, since you raised that risk earlier on, is there anything you would like to add on the connection and commissioning? You mentioned it earlier as an important.
Yeah, no, I think Ali makes. Yeah, I mean, I think Ali, has covered, you know, very eloquently. I think the observation around risk allocation is an important one, because previously the EPC contractors were immense. It's their modelling. It's a lot of interactions that they have on understanding their kit and how it feeds into the system. So there is quite a material shift away from contractors, and you can understand it. But I think that I think it's important, as Ian and Nick mentioned, just putting into your base case, you know, from an equity perspective, or from the debt, putting into your base case what you actually think are the realistic timings. Again, there's a slant to being more sort of pessimistic, I think, rather than being optimistic on some of these things. Yeah.
A bit more risk averse.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Andrew. I think we've gone from there was an enormous amount of optimism around, you know, those grid outcomes, and there's definitely, I think we've really swung the other direction. There's definitely a sense that, you know, people are sort of taking sometimes the downside on the downside case as their base case when they're sort of looking at that, given obviously the experience that some projects have had.
I think it's also worth being conscious of, you know, the sector is changing from right. We heard yesterday, you know, the sector was 600 gigawatt machines, right? Now on our newest projects that we're looking at, you're talking about 6 gigawatt onshore machines. So at a time when the grid is really constrained, AEMO modeling and remodeling all these impacts, you're now trying to add projects with, you know, 350 to 400 megawatts of capacity coming. You know, it's a sizable step change, and so all of those things just ramp up another notch. And so that level of diligence, modeling, focus upfront is critical.
Thank you all. The next topic is one that was raised earlier by the panelists as well. So the lack of certainty in the policy and regulatory space. So we know that that's been an issue for quite a long time. there are some politics to it as well. Regulatory space alone is also very uncertain and changing, and sometimes a bit slow to keep up with some of the climate science particularly. So what are the impacts for those long-term investment decisions that you need to make? How do you consider that risk in your assessments? I'm also interested to hear about the impact it might have on how appealing an Australian project might be compared to a project overseas, perhaps, where some of the policy settings might be a bit clearer. So just interested to hear about that, and also thinking about future policies that haven't been decided on. For example, the AEMC keeps talking about locational marginal pricing. How does that sort of weigh in your decisions? So we might go to Nick first, and then we'll ask Ali.
Maybe let's step back. I think policy settings, regulatory frameworks, how the rules are applied. Really what you need to do is have it so that the objective of all of this is that you attract capital into the sector longer term. So ultimately, if you achieve that, you'll get more supply in the sector, prices come down. So it's a standard base of what we need to achieve. So we really need to get that right. And we need to get it on a global scale because the investor base is global. In fact, a couple of years ago, when the all MLF issues started to raise their head, we started getting together as a group, and we did some analysis ourselves saying, like, who is invested in Australia's renewable space to get a view from. Now, yes, there are a couple of local providers. You've got, the Power JV here, you've got ICG that are in there, and increasingly Australian super funds are investing in the sector, but in the operational side, so de-risk projects. So, but if you actually look at it, the main investors of the top 20 are global investors. So these are organizations based offshore, a million miles away from hearing the policy decisions here and decision-making ideas that can allocate capital on a global basis on a risk return. So teams there looking there, where should we allocate? And once it moves, it moves. So it's very important that we are, as Australia, competitive in our policy framework against other jurisdictions. And some parts where we play, and Ian and the GIG team of portfolio players, you've got 20-year offtake contracts, feed-in tariffs to government entities. That is a phenomenally different position to Australia than what we've got, and we're seeing that. So we need to always remember to be competitive on a global market so that capital will continue to come here. I think the next thing is, we need clear investment signals, and capital will follow clear investment signals. And then you also need confidence that those settings will prevail over what is now long life assets. 15 years has now become 25, 30 years. So we need to know that and be confident there. So how do we mitigate? It's hard. We spend a lot of time looking at the regulations here. We spend a lot of time being a contributor to those discussions and thinking. Marilyn, your role at the CEIG, this was an organization we set up a couple of years ago as the big investors in the space to say, how do we have a seat at the table? Renewables is still a nascent industry in Australia, growing fast, and we'll need to grow fast, but we need to fight. So important, this was a forum for the large capital providers to engage with the various regulatory bodies, government institutions, energy ministers to say, hey, we don't want to tell you what to do, but we want to say, if you're thinking about things, chat with us, because we as allocators of capital want to have settings that will continue so we will invest in it. And I think that's absolutely critical. And we really welcome that engagement that's happening. And we'd like to see it going forward all the time. Think about the change you're making, engage, and we keep going forward. So collectively, we deliver on these, tens and tens of gigawatts that need to be, erected, connected, and dispatching in the next sort of 4, 5 years, 6 years.
Indeed. Thank you.
Look, I fully agree with what you're saying, Nick. I mean, when you look at the market, it is a global market. A lot of the investors are actually, Marilyn, playing in across a number of different jurisdictions. So to your point, when they look at our market design, they're comparing it with what they're seeing offshore. What's the level of certainty that they're getting in relation to, cash flows and whatnot. So I think that is something to think about. What are the investors we want to crowd in? Because that will determine the market design element. So the more risk you're putting on generators, you're going to be attracting, a higher cost of equity, cost of debt, and ultimately a higher price to consumers. On the reform front, there's a lot. I mean, the ESB, the post 2025 reforms, I mean, there's a lot in that. To your question about location or marginal pricing, I mean, on the transition side, I think we've come a long way. We've done whole of system planning. We've got creation of reses. You've got, the committed and actionable ISPs. So we've come a long way, and there's a lot of investment to come. I think when you take the ISB 2020, for instance, you've got another 26 gigawatts of renewables coming online, 19 gigawatts of dispatchable. So there's a lot of investment to be had. I don't know, in terms of, the key thing to remember on the design is not to be focused so much on, that sort of economic purist model, but rather, giving certainty, as I think Ian was mentioning, over, decades of investment. That's probably more relevant. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of the congestion management mechanism with the rebates within reses and whatnot. And it's quite different to, the COGADI, FTRs and the settlement residue that everyone was trying to work through. So maybe simplicity, certainty over a long period, and the less fluctuations you're going to crowd in superannuation money, cheaper forms of cost of equity and debt, I'd say.
It's critical, as you both pointed out, that Australia remains competitive, isn't it? Because capital will flow elsewhere and will flow overseas. And so those market designs will have a huge impact.
Yeah, and I think, COP26 changes the whole playing field again. Right? So you've got a lot of governments that have come back post the session of COP26 and corporates, and said, well, hang on, we want to increase our targets. We want to be competitive against others. And so they might change their policies, and we need to be lockstep to make sure that the capital doesn't shift elsewhere.
Thank you all. The next topic is around choosing sites for wind projects, as well as the social license. So developers choose a site based on the resource quality, but also the quality of the transmission access, the system strength in the area, the potential MLF, as we've discussed, based on landholder negotiations, etc. It's also really critical to have a social license for the project with the local community, with traditional owners. And the next session will go into a lot more depth on that topic. But how do these aspects weigh into the projects that you consider? And again, how do you mitigate some of those risks? So we'll go to Ian first and then Andrew.
Sure, thank you. It is a sort of a huge part of the analysis that we do around the sector as well. There's obviously a number of factors you can change with projects. You can change your contractor. You can have a different type of turbine, and you can put a battery in to augment to assist. But the site is the site, and there, if there are material issues around, particularly that sort of transmission grid side, that can be create sort of a very sort of bright line in regard to ability to sort of proceed with it. With the transaction and the development or not. So it is something we do spend an enormous amount of time looking at. We've developed a number of projects here, a number of projects that are in our pipeline as well to develop with the GIG. And all of those, there's been an enormous amount of diligence looking at these sort of very aspects around it to ensure that there are those, call it the hard facts are able to be delivered on. The second part, and this is something that I think not just Macquarie, but others in the market have come a long way around, is those sort of softer aspects. And you mentioned social license, and that really is a key part of it as well. I think as the build out of sites has developed, we've gone from very good remote sites to sites that are obviously closer to other stakeholders, and the impact on those stakeholders is an increasingly important part of our assessment as well, to ensure that we seem to be a developer that is supporting all stakeholders as part of that, and that can have its challenges. In a lot of our offshore investments, we've been very proactive in employing people even on payroll to sort of manage that stakeholder process, where we've been sort of lead developer to ensure that we've got the appropriate sort of structure in place, and that there's no sort of negative sort of feedback coming around what might be that development side. And the other one as well, I just sort of touched on, is increasingly around issues on constructability and ensuring that the sites are also safe for contractors and staff and people that are actually coming onto site. That's another point that we're quite focused on as well, and we have a global team that manages that risk across our department as well.
Excellent, thank you, Ian. Andrew?
Thanks, Marilyn. I think positive social license is vital for the success of a project, and certainly any finance that we put towards wind projects is conditional on there being a positive social license. And one of the interesting things is that no community is the same. So it's very important that there are people on the ground, there are proper consultation and engagement, and also with the traditional owners to ensure that the dialogue is two-way, such that when you are, and it starts early. So I don't want to spoil the next session, but it's got to start early. It's got to have the and have the community to feel as though where there are pinch points that they're able to help contribute to the design of the wind farm. But there are a couple of, even the community side of things is changing. Certainly things are a lot better, and we look for best practice in the things that we do. But there are new challenges. We talk about the size of the machines, much bigger now than what they were, which has a different visual impact that we might have seen previously. Also, we're seeing increased clustering of wind farms into regions, which is an important thing. So the first one might be okay, the second one, but by the time you get to the third, it creates some more angst. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge each of those, and also transmission. We can't forget that transmission is critical, and the build out of transmission, and ensuring that there really is equitable benefit sharing with not just the host, but also with neighbours and the community. A couple of things that we are seeing: decommissioning is becoming more of a focus. So with hosts, obviously, but also with the bigger machines, the noise can be a concern, particularly when you're also seeing projects going into more populated areas, more densely populated, I should say. It's really important to have good noise due diligence to ensure that and also taking things, things like tonality into consideration, such that there's comfort that the machines won't produce more than what they say they will. So that's next session, but look, it's critical, and we spend an enormous amount of time with our investments, as Nick knows.
Well, thanks for sharing that. It's great to hear about that greater sophistication that's coming about in this space too. Very important topic. I'll ask one more question of the panel, and then I'll open for questions from the audience. So get your questions ready. The final question is around the uncertainty around the timing of coal closures and the impacts it has on prices, and particularly on the PPA market. So we've already had announcements from 2 coal power stations that they will be closing earlier than they had originally anticipated. And we can expect, I think, that trend to continue as more renewables put more pressure on prices. We also know that although there's stronger interest in the PPA market, particularly from corporates, some big programs that are coming up, say the New South Wales program, could also mean that the PPA is a bit on hold until some of these auctions kick in, etc. So I'm keen to hear from the panel what they think about those issues, particularly around prices, around timing of coal closures and the PPA market, and how they're all interlinked. So I'll throw this question open to anyone on the panel who wishes to comment. Do I have any takers?
I might start. That's the merchant element and the contracting is one of the key components that we look at. I think, Nick, to your point, it is a global market. When people look at 20-year arrangements in other jurisdictions. The question for us is how much of that contracting do we want in our system? So when we used to have, VRED 2 is fantastic because you get government support arrangements, and New South Wales Roadmap all assists. So it's actually a big part of how we assess projects. The other big limb, is what's the level of contracting of the deal, and it's a very different risk exposure, and it's become far more granular. Like utility scale solar, compare that to wind, and it's a very different dynamics in the way we look at it. Which part of the NEM? It's become far more granular and sophisticated in the way banks look at exposures. And I think that the other element is distributed generation. You've got 3 gigawatts coming online. And when you look at your pocket NEM during the course of the day, you sort of see a fair bit of negative pricing. So that's a phenomenon that will be increasingly part of what we do.
I think to my earlier point, very clear investment signals is a key focus for us. I think you've seen recent changes and commentary coming out of government where we were energy only markets. Everyone had factored in coal retirements. Even we thought a lot earlier in the project. Does a hybrid with a bit of capacity in there change it possibly? And we need to think that in. Ultimately, the coal will come out of the system. It is reaching end of life. It is increasingly becoming unsafe. You cannot run these plants in the way that they're not designed to do. And so operational issues will increase, safety factors will increase, and so ultimately they will be retired earlier than predicted. Yes, it's my personal view, and we're starting to see the evidence of that. But I think in that interim, you're going to have a period where you've got really increased supply, rooftop solar, utility scale projects, while some of this coal stays in the system. So, as Frank Calabria said, it's going to be a bit messy, this retirement. But I think once we're through that, you'll really see those prices recover, which that's what I think, again, clear regulatory settings.
One of the strategies we've been pursuing at the CFC on a wind side is our bridge to contracting strategy, such that we support the right projects, well located, connected projects, on a fully merchant basis at close, on the expectation, not the requirement, but the expectation that they will contract up over time. And it's fair to say it's been successful and underpinned by some great support from the corporates out there with the PPAs. So I think we should acknowledge that type of PPA is changing. The tenors are changing. The terms are changing. We're seeing, whether it's just a run of plant or a fixed firm style contracts, etc. So projects having the flexibility to be able to to navigate and build up a basket and been supporting. And the names that we see that come to the market looking for PPAs is just terrific, and that'll help. It certainly helps develop new projects, whether it be ones that start merchant or help underpin ones that require a level of contracting pre-financial close. Challenge is that projects are big now. It's not as though they're 100 megs, 150 megs. They're getting bigger and bigger. So to get a level of contracting at financial close for those larger projects is tough. So, which is one of the reasons why we support that bridge to contracting.
Excellent. Thank you for your insights. I might open to questions from the floor. You were all very clear in your explanations. In that case, I might just quickly call for a 1-minute closing comment from each of you. We might start with Andrew and work our way around the room.
Oh, I was hoping you'd start the other way.
I can go first, Andrew, if you like.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Ian. We'll start virtually.
We'll start for us. I think it's we're in a really, really exciting juncture where we are at the moment. We've got a number of really sort of key factors that are coming together. We have there's still a large coal generation fleet that does need to retire in the coming years and decades. There's an enormous amount of capital that is available that is looking to come into the market. We have a real recognition and a desire from corporates to be investing directly through the PPA market, and we've got a really strong sort of financing market here to support that. So I think there is an enormous opportunity set and a really pivotal part where we are at the moment that I'm very optimistic will tip the right way and really enable a lot of growth across the wind sector in Australia.
Thanks, Ian. I wholeheartedly agree. And I think part of the other thing is we're getting great technology from overseas. We're getting the newest and the best, which is terrific. Great levels of capital being crowded into the market, new names coming to the market, which is just wonderful. There is there's a great opportunity. I mean, we won't move then on to hydrogen and what else you can do with electrons, but it's an exciting time.
Yeah, look, I think a lot of the session we focused on risks and how to mitigate, and look, as bankers around me, that's their job. You've got to make sure that and as Swiss equity investors, we also on principal protection. That's our mandate. But I think to echo these thoughts, we are at this amazing junction. In terms of fundamentally changing a system, it'll last for 40, 50 years. Effectively, and we're right in the middle of it, and to be a part of it and the tangibility of what we're building and the excitement. I mean, we forget it sometimes when we sit in our models and our shareholder agreements and EPC contracts, but when you go out to site and see the fundamental change this industry is making to regional Australia and the economic growth that's happening there, the communities, the joy about wind projects being erected. We have a tradition when the first blade comes on site at our project, that the local schools come and sign the blade and put it up, and these kids all arrive, and they all want to become engineers and be more involved in science and see part of the history. So, teething issues we're going through, we'll get through all that with grid, we'll get through that with merchant prices. We'll build a great industry for the next 30, 40 years.
I think, look, you've articulated really well, Nick. We agree. We're very optimistic in that. I mean, there's a big investment opportunity, as Ian mentioned. Although there's issues in every sector, the bulk of the investment that's going to come in is extraordinary, and it's playing a big part in decarbonising what we have. So, and to your point around reframing it around how it adds to regional areas, jobs, and innovation, I think that's what we need to focus on as an industry, because there's a lot of let's say aspects of transactions that are highlighted, but all the benefits, social benefits that it brings, is something we need to focus on. We're very optimistic as bankers, actually. So we think there's a lot to be done in this space.
Oh, excellent. Thank you very much for your very positive comments. It's a great way to finish this panel conversation. So thank you to the panelists for their insights today. We will have a next session with Ben, I believe.
And terrific moderation from you, Marilyn. We finished exactly on time, which is exactly what we want at today's session. So thank you so much to yourself, to Andrew, Ellie, Ian and Nick for your insights. Absolutely terrific conversation. But now we're going to turn our attention from the numbers, guys, to the people. And in the next session, we're going to be focusing in on community engagement and stakeholder relations. The session is entitled How to Build and Enhance Good Relationships with Local Communities and Stakeholders. And Ben Smith is going to be our moderator. He's from NGH, the General Manager of Communications and Sustainability at the organisation. Over the last 23 years, Ben has supported more than 150 major projects, including some of Australia's largest transport, renewable energy and water infrastructure projects. He has held very senior roles as well in state government, the private corporations, infrastructure advisory firms and local government. He is incredibly passionate about the development of resilient regions and communities using smart, people-centred planning and balanced infrastructure decision-making. So welcome to the stage, Ben. Look forward to your moderation.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction and welcome everyone. It's a very exciting session to be speaking to. I think we have some people here in person. We have two of our speakers online. So Erin and Andrew, if you could come up. I'm just going to give a little, I guess, a little lead in to this topic, and then I'll ask the speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll get right into the discussion. I have to say this is a hot topic, and I'm very excited to say that. All of the amazing speakers we've heard from so far have mentioned the importance of developing trust, developing real partnerships, and creating and maintaining social license. Now more than ever, we know that social license underpins the feasibility of any project. And without it, we face the real risk of failure for our projects, for our industries, and also for our collective clean energy and climate aspirations. We also know, as we've heard earlier today, that it's not easy. This is good engagement. It's not straightforward, and it's not easily predictable. It requires genuine effort, commercial nous, well-informed strategies, and more than anything else, a whole stack of respect, empathy, and pragmatism for the people and places that we're asking to accept our infrastructure. Thankfully today, we have 4 of the best practitioners in Australia to share their insights on how to do this well and how to respond to the many challenges we have ahead of us. So before we get into the discussion, I'll just ask each of the presenters to introduce themselves and I guess their current focus in relation to this topic. Might start with Erin.
Thanks, Ben. And I agree, this is a very timely and important conversation that we're having. So I'm going to start off, some people know in this industry that I drive a Tesla. So I have to start off with something I heard from Elon Musk about 12 months ago, which has stuck with me. He said, it's time that executives and CEOs spent less time on PowerPoint, less time in meetings, more time on the factory floor. And it stuck with me because I thought, I spend a lot of time in meetings and on PowerPoint. We don't have a factory floor yet, but I do spend a lot of time in Gippsland. And why is it important to do that? It's to know how to make your project better. And that's what Elon said, it's to innovate, make your product better. And it's so important that we hear the stories of those local communities so that we can understand what's important to them. Just to share a few brief stories from Gippsland, where I spend a lot of my time, I was really inspired this week by the Woodside community. For more than 170 years, the pub was the heart of their town. For 5 years, it has been a pub with no beer. It's a tragedy. So this week, a fundraiser started. Some locals have banded together to buy that pub, and they're getting it going again. Another story that touched my heart was in Yarram when I first started in this project in 2018 and learnt that it was the first time in 120 years that Yarram had not been able to field a cricket team. They didn't have enough men. The third story I'll share is an email I received in 2019 from a lady called Mary Lou, who lived in South Gippsland, not that close to our project, but close enough. And she said, this project is so important to our community. I'm the mother of teenage boys. I know that as soon as they finish school and turn 18, they will move away because there's no job opportunities here for them. She said, the work you are doing is so important because it's giving our community hope. So what's the link in those 3 stories? It's people in their towns, it's economic prosperity, it's having opportunities. And how does that link with an offshore wind farm? It's nice that we're talking about pubs and cricket in South Gippsland, which is a beautiful place, but it tells me that if we're going to come into this community and build a project, we need to find opportunities for these locals. We need to involve them from early days and find out what's important as well as what the issues are. So I'm really driven, and our team is really driven by finding those local opportunities, whether it's in the development phase, opening a local office, hiring local people. And there's a wonderful story of a person in our team called Stella who did move to Melbourne when she graduated, but she's moved back to Yarram because there's a job there for her on Star of the South. And we're looking to be Australia's first offshore wind project, but we're also hoping to create an industry that will put Gippsland on the map and enable it to continue generating power into the future. So I start with those stories because they're ones that I've heard and I like to share with communities like this in the business world and encourage you all to get out and spend some time out in the regions. I'll hand over to Andy, I think.
Thanks very much, Erin. That's a wonderful introduction, I have to say. Great to get a sense of the flavour of the communities you're working in. So yeah, just by way of introduction, I'm the National Director for an organisation called Realliance, or Renewable Energy Alliance. We're a community advocacy group for renewables, so we sit in a slightly different space. We really want to see the transition to renewables happen as quickly as possible. So, you know, something along the lines of 100% renewable by 2030 is kind of the target where we need to be aiming for to meet the climate goals that I think we're all, you know, working towards. But to do that, it's a massive project in regional Australia, and you know, I think we all understand sort of roughly the dimensions of this. We have maybe 10 gigawatts of wind at the moment, and you can already drive around a place like where I live in Bungendore, which is outside of Canberra, and see, you know, in half an hour's drive, you can see 7 or 8 wind farms in that area already. So we're going to be building maybe 4 times as much wind as we have now in the next 10 years. And that's the sort of thing that we're going to be seeing. So what we need to be considering is what kind of citizen the industry is in these places. What's the impact that we're going to be having, and how do we make the places better for the presence of these wind farms that we'll be building. So while a session like today's one is really good in the we finally get to the nuts and bolts, you know, how do you build and enhance those good relationships? But it's worth sort of stepping back and thinking, what do these communities need, whether it's the sort of examples of Woodside or Yarram, or more broadly, you know, what are the communities we're going into? Some of them are quite low socioeconomic ones. How do we play a part in making them better? So part of it is around benefit sharing in your, you know, project area, landholders, neighbours, but also the broader community, and making sure that all the interactions we have are based around trusting relationships, doing what you say you're going to do, being open and listening to people, seeking out information, particularly in the First Nations space. You've got to be quite proactive to really engage well there. So they're the kind of things we're interested in. I'm really keen to tease those ones out in this session.
Charlie, can we hear from you?
Now I can hear you. Oh, hi. I hope you can hear me. I'm sorry I'm not there with you in person. It just wasn't going to happen this year for me. I'm speaking to you from Gundungurra land, which is about an hour and a half north of Canberra, right in the heart of the hot zone for renewable energy on the Southern Tablelands, north of where Andrew lives. I'm speaking to you, I'm the chair of Farmers for Climate Action, the corporate behind me that you can see. Farmers for Climate Action represent over 7,000 farmers across Australia. And that's important because all of the infrastructure, except for the offshore wind farms, is going to be built on farms in Australia. And if the ambition is there, as it's been articulated in New South Wales, then all of those farmers and the communities they live in and the neighbours, as Andrew's very clearly articulated, are not going to have, they're going to be integrally involved in this rollout. New South Wales' ambition is to build as many wind turbines and or solar panels as already exist in all of Australia. That has to be built in New South Wales in the next, which are controversial, as you know. So unless we get it right, that is going to, if we get it wrong, that is going to start another climate war. And that happened in my area where I live. because of less than best practice community engagement and communication from a number of different developers. In 2012, 2013, the climate wars here were the wind farm controversy here was feeding directly into the climate wars, which were instigated by the toppling of the Gillard government. Rudd government was the Gillard government. So we just can't afford for that to happen again. And the way that I want to address this is to focus on the community engagement stuff is really important, but there needs to be a plan. And there is no plan from the federal government. There are plans from state governments across the jurisdiction of Australia, and that's great. There's no federal plan. There's a proposal for a plan. It was introduced by a lady called Helen Haynes, the member for the federal seat of Indi. And it's called the Local Power Agency. And it's taking community engagement to a next level where it's not stipulating, but it's not stipulating that you must, but it's saying you have to offer, if you're a developer of a wind farm or a solar farm, renewable infrastructure, you have to offer equity in that program to the local constituents. And I think that will be an extra level of engagement with the local community, which will negate the big green elephant in the room, which is jealousy. Neighbour agreements are fine, but the standard neighbour agreements around here at the moment are nothing like adequate compared to the amount of money that the hosts are getting. So that creates jealousy within communities, which creates resistance, which slows down projects. We just heard of a session on risk. The biggest risk developers are taking is to get their local communities offsite, because if that happens, there's delays, there's potential court hearings, there's all sorts of costs. And then further delay and risk to the whole industry as a consequence of that. So I want to focus on this local power agency bill that Helen Haynes has proposed. It's sitting on the bench, on the table in Parliament House, and it hasn't even been debated. It needs to be. We need a plan for this to go forward. So I'm speaking to you on behalf of those 7,000 farmers from Gundungurra land. I acknowledge the elders from this land that are here. We had an elder here the other day who on my farm, which has turbines on it, by the way. And it's really important that we also engage strongly with Indigenous owners. I'll leave it at that for the moment, but I'm looking forward to participating in the panel.
Thanks, Charlie. Some great points. We'll definitely come back to those. Over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Ben. Good morning, everybody. Like Charlie, sorry, I can't be there in person. I join from the Palawa land in Tasmania, and more specifically the Mwinina people land here in Hobart. So sending our wishes from Tassie there to mainland Australia. My perspective I'm bringing to this panel, to this discussion, is from a transmission development perspective. It's been touched on. I think from all market research, the vast majority of Australians do see and have a desire to meet a zero emissions future, to support the growth of renewable energy as a fundamental underpinning of our future economy and future job just development. But we know transmission is an essential component of that. And we're anticipating very soon in the coming days, the Australian Energy Market Operators draft 2022 Integrated System Plan, which sets the future and framework for renewable energy zone development together with the priorities for transmission. And when you step back and you look at that, it's vast, expansive in relatively short amount of time. So the challenge ahead of us is how do you develop at pace, at scale, whilst bringing communities, landowners and local economies on the journey meaningfully with you. And I guess that's the perspective I want to share, particularly from the project that I'm working on, which is Marinus Link. It's a 1,500 megawatt high voltage direct current undersea and underland cable connecting Tasmania to Victoria, but just enhancing the interconnection capacity across the national electricity market. It's for those not as familiar with the sizes of megawatts, it's the equivalent size of energy transfer capacity of a power station like Hazelwood. So it's significant. It's underpinned by a business case which sees the need for access to deep, long duration energy storage in the form of pumped hydro, which Tasmania has already excess hydro capacity, plus fantastic low cost prospect of further pumped hydro energy storage opportunity. It can only get away into the market and underpin that renewable energy future through interconnection like Marinus Link. And I want to bring also a perspective, not just from a developer. I'm a proud member of a 6th generation farming family from central Victoria, beef and wool growing property where we've had over many years interest from wind developers. And also I can see the shift that's occurring just socially, not only economically in the agricultural sector and under future climate scenarios, but I want to also bring some perspectives where farmers particularly are very, very sophisticated business operators, and there are certain ways renewable energy and transmission developers can work with and talk to landowners, particularly farmers, in ways that resonate. And I think there are fantastic opportunities going forward to change the way we work with communities, work with landowners, that strikes the balance between the developments that we will require and do require with the needs and priorities of those local communities. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Ben. I think it'd be good to move on to some of the how and use the expertise we have in this panel to move on to the how. So if we come back to you, Erin, I think, I guess the foundation of this is, the fundamental aspects of bringing people along the journey, particularly for a project of the scale that you're involved in. What sort of, I guess, lessons and tips and focus areas can you share with this audience?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I often feel perplexed about because I feel like it's not rocket science, but I'm going to go there anyway. And I think it's, Andy's sort of touched on this already. It's starting at those first principles of engagement and respect being a very big one. And I see this a lot with developers, if you treat social license and community consultation as a transaction, if you see it as a necessary step to get your approval, it's usually going to go badly because it's often too late. So we really prioritise relationships, building relationships before even introducing the project, going out there and understanding who's who in the town. As I say, what's important to them? What do they see as the issues? What do they see as the opportunities? Because it helps to build that trust from day one. And of course, you need to do that with all stakeholders. It can't just be talking to the local MP and thinking you've talked to the representative. You need to be very proactive with the traditional owners, and we've got a great partnership with the Gunai Kurnai and want to take that forward in our Gippsland project. But equally, it's just the local pub owner, the local motel owner, finding out from people on the ground. You've got landholders, obviously, which Charlie's touched on, that are critically important. We see them as partners in our project while we're out at sea, and our landlord would be the Commonwealth Government. We also have a transmission line that we need to build from the coast up to the Latrobe Valley. And I think what you find when you talk with people is that they understand new sources of power are needed, and particularly in the regions. They understand about climate change, but they are rightly very concerned about the impacts to them from this infrastructure. So early in our project, we developed some principles of engagement which centre around openness, being open and being out there, being accountable. So not only having a team that works specifically on community and stakeholder engagement, but that goes all the way to the top. So whether it's myself or our CEO, Casper, or our board members when they fly out from Denmark, they will be spending time in Gippsland to hear from people and to make those relationships. It's about flexibility. So you might have a certain idea of how you want to design and build your project, but it's about being flexible and trying to incorporate the ideas and suggestions of those local communities. from an early stage before it's too late. And it's about authenticity. I think, we touched on this, but people can, they can tell whether you're authentic or whether you're just there to tick a box and get your approval and move on. And we often talk about, it's funny, the word social license, because it's not actually a piece of paper. It's not a license you can get. It's something that you have to build up over many, many years. We are a project that is not looking to start construction until at least 2025, but we've been engaging since 2016. So that's 9 years worth of engagement before we even plan to build something. And a lot of people will say, well, doesn't that take a lot of resources and money and energy? But I would say, look at the risks. And again, it's quite neat following the financiers section. Look at the risks. It's not to say we're not going to have challenges. Of course, our project is going to have impacts that we need to deal with, but also it's about owning that and, acknowledging it. And it's also why I think it's great that we live in a democracy where people can go to their local member, or they can take you to court if they're not happy with an outcome. But if you've done all of the right things, you should get the right result in the end.
Great, thank you. Now, Andrew, one of the common themes we've heard throughout the conference so far when we've been talking about res zones or just really the proliferation of our projects is that, what that means for communities and the potential for over-engagement of common impacts. And what's your perspective on this, and what does good look like in that space, and who needs to lead?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you're right. It's something I see in a few of these conferences, is that it doesn't matter what the session is, the social license part of it creeps in. And certainly on the financial risk side, that's very much one of them. And I appreciate hearing you, Andrew, in the earlier session. And I do want to acknowledge the role of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation under Oliver Yates, because I think one of the things that I think we can really celebrate in this room is that actually the wind industry has really picked up its game in terms of doing the harder work to secure social license. So wind had a bit of a baptism of fire in the last decade, I think, from local communities pushing back. And that's really lifted the bar in wind. So that's sort of a good starting point. But then once you come into the renewable energy zone context, you're working alongside a number of solar developers, potentially probably transmission lines, but possibly also battery, pumped hydros, all sorts of other projects. So you've got two issues. One is that the other developers working around you may not have the same high bar in terms of community engagement that you might have with your project. And to a certain extent, once projects are coming together, people will still sort of see you all as the wind farm people or the renewable people, the energy company people. So you get a bit lumped in together. So you've got that kind of issue. But secondly, your projects, you could be dealing with the same community. There could be 3 projects all dealing with the same community of people. And so you have a sense where everyone's, let's assume everyone's wanting to do best practice engagement. They're wanting to get out, talk to the local Rotary Club and all the different groups. But the Rotary Club and the different groups are all the same people. And they've got, developers knocking on their door to put some infrastructure on their land. They want to talk to them because they're part of the cricket club, and at the same time they just want to live their lives. So it's like death by kindness. Everyone's wanting to talk to them all the time about this stuff, but the over engagement is going to be a real issue. And I think here this is perhaps a role for any government people in the room, but I think particularly at the state government level, I think coordinating that kind of engagement, I think there's a real role for government to be coordinating, but for all proponents to have their antennas up and realise when that's becoming an issue, and adjusting your plans accordingly.
Great, thank you. So to you, Ben, so I guess between yourself and Erin, you share some common communities and the need for engagement and partnerships. What's your perspective on how we do this well in an integrated manner?
Thanks, Ben. Well, I think Erin really touched on that well, that this takes time. Projects, particularly of significant scale, like Erin Star of the South, like Marinus Link, remembering Marinus Link has a significant stretch underground through South Gippsland, but also right across the 250 kilometres of the Bass Strait, and then around 230 kilometres of overhead transmission development in northwest Tasmania. So we are dealing with a piece of linear infrastructure in my project of around 600 kilometres, and you pick up an extraordinary diversity of communities with issues and preferences, different landscapes, land use values. So you have to really do your homework and start early to understand what those particular issues, concerns, constraints, and values are before even really you start having conversations externally, because you need to come with a level of information, a level of understanding to really then sit and listen properly to then take on board how you go about designing and developing your project. So I think, and again, just to build on Erin's great comment, there's probably an investment up front with a significant time dedication, but that investment up front and that time dedication really does, if done well, bodes project proponents together with communities in a partnership sense, sets them up much better for success. Because if you don't do it well, it's either a dead duck project that costs a lot more, and your reputation is significantly damaged. So I think taking that time, being prepared, and getting even at board level, let alone government level and community level, people understanding you have to dedicate the right and adequate amount of time. And I think we're living in just such an extraordinary hybrid of drivers and challenges, particularly with COVID. I know in our project, as another example, here I am based in Hobart, but from Victoria. We've just not been able to get on ground personally of late, and that really does set up some challenges. So you have to kind of factor all of these things in reality, and you've got to also understand what other pressures communities are under. And I know, again, in South Gippsland or Gippsland more broadly, if it wasn't COVID, it's fires, and it's floods, and other workforce-related pressures with past and pending coal closure. So really understanding that circumstance, but also helping contribute to an aspiring vision for these communities. And that's really something we're dedicated to do, is put Gippsland back at the heart of the future energy sector, and build a relationship, particularly between the northwest of Tasmania and Gippsland, where we see so many similarities of legacy and history and capability. We want to help connect those communities, both figuratively but literally, with Marinus Link.
Thanks, Ben. So, Charlie, I'd like to get your perspective on this, particularly keeping in mind that, and you've touched on this already, but there's a real risk of sort of creating winners and losers, and creating rifts in long-held communities. So I know you've experienced it, and I've seen it recently where our family farm used to be, through a transmission corridor. How do you, or what sort of advice do you give, as a farmer and as a representative of Farmers for Climate Action, in terms of managing that in the best way possible?
I think Erin and Andrew and Ben have all highlighted the fact that if you get it wrong first up, then it's really, really, really hard and difficult and expensive and time consuming to fix that. So you have to get it right from the start. That said, the communities themselves do have a level of responsibility here. It's not just a one-way partnership that we're talking about. And the level of government that I would like to focus on is local government. The area where I live, there was no leadership from local government because it was all too hard. But that was a consequence of, as I said earlier, less than great communication from various wind farm companies that were working in this area. So once the local government agency, the local council, is offside or is frightened of going to that space because it's so controversial, there needs to be a level of support within the community for a project to to change the council's position. Council's local government is the epitome of populist politics. And anything that's popular, they will flock to, and anything that's controversial, they will run away from. In fact, they'll speed away from it in a Tesla. I think that is the critical issue, building community support for any project, whether it's a transmission line, whether it's a solar farm, and whether it's a wind farm. And in my opinion, the best way to do that is to offer the locals particularly, but the community generally, the local community, an opportunity to buy into the project. Maybe to be gifted some equity in the project, but definitely the opportunity to buy into that project. And that's why I'm such a strong supporter of this local power agency bill, because it mandates that the developers must offer that equity. It doesn't mandate that equity has to be taken up, but the offer has to be made. And then community leaders tend to emerge, as is done in my community. Community leaders tend to emerge, whether they're part of the council or not. And then the whole dynamic of the discussion about any renewable project becomes, how can we make the best of this rather than how can we stop this? And even there's a classic example of it in Victoria, the Canoa Bridge wind farm, which offered equity from day one to anybody within a geographical scope. I can't remember the numbers, Andrew will know, of the wind turbines. There was one person who was adamantly opposed to the wind farm. It's only a small wind farm, but she still took up the opportunity to invest in that in that proposal. There is difficulties in that, and it's always harder to get community involvement than it is to get corporate involvement. But that's the nub of what we're talking about, is community engagement. Like out in regional Australia, in all of Australia, communities during the pandemic, we've all of a sudden realised how important communities are. And these communities in regional Australia, if we get this right, everybody's going to want to flock to regional Australia, not because of the pandemic, because it's going to be a great place to live. It's going to be offering all of the things that Ben and Erin have outlined, and Andrew. And it's also going to be offering a new future, because energy production will be in regional Australia. So that will attract industry. That doesn't happen at the government level. Government, particularly at federal government level, particularly in Australia, unfortunately, we're not great, they're not great leaders. But if you make it impossible for them not to follow you, they'll follow you, and they'll pretend to be leading the charge, and that's fine. I don't care who takes credit for this. But if the politicians see something that's popular, they will flock to it as well. So we need to get the engagement right. We need to focus on community leaders, and we need to really engage closely with local government in the absence of any sort of overarching plan. I'm suggesting there should be a plan from the federal government. It probably won't happen, but you know, it happens in Europe. And the same companies that operate in Australia operate in Europe under exactly what's being proposed with this local power agency bill. So horses for courses, I guess. If they don't have to do it here, they won't. But if they do have to do it here, they will. And they've already proved, and I'm not disparaging anybody, any individuals. We've already proved that if you can do it, because it's working in Europe. And they're rolling out, as Ben, I think, suggested, they're rolling out large-scale renewable projects in really quite densely populated areas compared to Australia, with not a lot of resistance. In fact, a lot of enthusiasm for those projects. So that's the key. And from a farmer's perspective, wealthy farmers are happy farmers. We've seen that in the last couple of years. And because of the breaking of the drought and the extraordinary level of commodity prices at the moment, but not all farmers are wealthy, not all farmers are as capable. There's different levels of farmers are a very disparate group. But if we can offer them the opportunity to ease the ride of the burden of farming, which I've experienced, I think we should be doing that to as many farmers as we possibly can. Not because it's the right thing to do, but because it actually, from a company's perspective, from a developer's perspective, it's an advantage, because those developers will be seen to be good corporate citizens, which will lead to opportunities, further opportunities in those communities they're working in.
Thanks, Charlie. One of the items you mentioned was, I guess, working with council and working with community leaders. Now, community consultative committees are, a strong feature within wind farm developments. I was wondering, Andrew, if you might be able to provide some commentary on whether it's a CCC or some of the work that you're doing in the res space in terms of helping communities to plan for their future. How do we best engage with that and make the most of these groups?
Yeah, I think the situation you absolutely want to avoid is the sense with local communities that stuff is being done to them and they have no say over it. So, and all of the engagement things that everyone's been discussing already, go some way to that. They say here, we're coming to you with these projects. These are the ways in which we think you can be involved. These are the ways you can have your say. This is the agency you can have over this process. So some of the work, we have a focus at the moment around the Central West Arana res in New South Wales. It's the first sort of, deliberately constructed res in the country. And we're essentially going out and engaging with local communities and saying to them, well, what do you want to see out of this renewable energy zone? As part of that, there's a sort of, we're explaining a little bit about what it is because there's not a lot of information out there to date. But what are the things you want for your community that the res might be able to deliver? And then working through the thing of, okay, well, these are the things we want. These are the avenues we can pursue, whether it's working with individual proponents, with the transmission company, with the state government processes. We're sort of seeing that as a way in which we can engage the local community and get them on the front foot and being actively involved. So it's as with the whole res project across the country, it's the first one is going to be a bit of a trial, so we'll see the extent to which that works. Triple C's community consultative committees are obviously a mechanism that's used in an existing way to be that sort of conduit of information on a project level. And I think they'll continue to be important for project by project. But again, you could have a situation where the same people are being asked to come out, 3 nights a week for different projects in a space. So that's a challenge to be aware of.
Great. So we're getting pretty close to time. So I might just invite our panel members to provide any final thoughts, and then we'll get some questions from the floor. So, Erin.
Sure. So I'll keep it short because we've touched on some great stuff already, and I'm really keen for any questions from the group here. But I'll go back to what I said at the start in terms of what our priorities are at Star of the South, and it is about finding those opportunities for our local communities that we're working with. I know there's a lot of suppliers in this room, so obviously there's some developers, maybe government people, but there's loads of suppliers. I get a lot of suppliers contacting me wanting to give a presentation and talk about their capabilities. I would throw down the challenge. If you're going to reach out and want to talk about working with us, please tell me what you can do that's good for Gippsland, because it's going to be much more powerful and helpful for us if we're working with all aspects of the supply chain, all of our stakeholders, to try and get good outcomes for our communities. So that's just a little parting message for this crowd today.
Thanks, Erin.
I think one thing that's in a way, that this discussion is focused on how to make the community sort of interaction work in an on the ground way. But I want to just go back quickly to the one of the earlier comments I made around what sort of citizen or presence is the industry going to be in regional Australia. And I think there's actually a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of a sort of broader societal narrative. So it's almost at a sort of industry level rather than a proponent level around why regional Australia should be part of the energy transition. At the moment, you know, regional Australia is there to grow food and fibre. You know, they're there to do whatever their jobs are in, you know, food production industries or whatever or mining industries, whatever it happens to be. What is it? What's in it for them to be part of the renewable energy transformation? And I think at the moment that narrative is not out there. That link hasn't yet been made. And it gets built up, you know, sort of project by project through the work that you're doing in Gippsland, through the work that's being done in Tassie with Marinus and all across the country. But at the same time, there's a broader piece, and I think that's perhaps something as an industry we need to be thinking about.
That's a really good point. I think a very related piece is this sort of wider rationale for transmission as well, and how it relates to community. So I know, Ben, we've had a discussion on this. I don't know if you want to include that in your final comments.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think everyone's contributed fantastically this morning. Part of our challenge too as a transmission business is operating under market rules, which have also energy consumers and energy customers at the heart, and to deliver the most cost-efficient form of reliable and now low-cost clean energy. So I just wanted to, in a introductory way, put that on the table as well, as part of meeting all the different sets of objectives, issues, concerns, particularly of communities, landowners. I think it's also worth just placing on the table energy consumers, which there's, you know, a vast majority, obviously, at a residential level through to business and industry. So I think a mature discussion publicly that sees an energy transition to meet that overarching climate objective for our own livability needs to take into account a whole suite of drivers. There's a commercial driver, but there's a social, economic and cultural set of drivers. We need to kind of bring that together, bring everyone's awareness and understanding of all those nuances and trade-offs, and have a mature discussion about how do we deliver on this exciting future whilst you don't leave anyone behind.
Thanks, Ben. Charlie?
Thanks, Ben. Just very quickly, totally endorse what the other three speakers have said. But I think we have to be really cognizant that there needs to be legislative change in this country, in this space, particularly in relation to transmission lines, particularly in New South Wales, but I'm assuming in other states as well. The existing legislation is 40 or 50 years old, and it was designed for those transmission companies when they were government owned. That's no longer the case in New South Wales. That needs to change, and I think we absolutely need legislative change in the space of creating an overarching plan, model rules, if you like, for wind and solar developers. I know this is a wind industry for solar developers as well across Australia, so that they include the regional communities in their plans. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Charlie. So we're going to move to questions from the floor, but I'd actually like to throw one out to the speakers from the previous session. I'm quite curious about this myself. When you talk about social license, so this is for Andrew, Ali and Nicholas, in terms of making funding decisions, what sort of evidence do you seek to understand if there is social license?
if I could answer that quickly from here, Ben, I don't know if you can hear me or not. I would say you've achieved social license if you've got people arguing for more wind turbines or more solar panels rather than less wind turbines or less solar panels or less transmission lines. That's when you've got social license.
Great. Thanks, Charlie.
And thanks, Ben. A lot of ways we look at it. I think one thing I did neglect to mention was the Australian Energy Commissioner, who plays a very important role. So we spent considerable time with Andrew and his team understanding the dynamics of the local community, understanding issues that may have arisen. But you know, it's a lot of things. It's like working through the whole development process, looking through the objections that have come through and how they've sought to be addressed in the design process. It's looking through the CCC minutes and spending time with the developers and the social license people within the community representatives within their organisations to understand the dynamics. And then going and have a look at the site. Ridge wind farms tend to have more issues in some regards than Ridge wind farms. So understanding and looking at the visual amenities side of things from the different perspective and from different hosts and from different neighbourhood positioning. So there's for us there's a lot, and we as Andrew mentioned, it's a strong component.
Great, thank you. Yep. Question over here. Just over here.
Thanks for the session. Phil Hart with WindLab. I live about half an hour north of Ballarat, not far from the AusNet transmission project, and site manager for Canoa Bridge that got mentioned by Charlie there, and Kayada further western Victoria. Kayada particularly stands to benefit from that transmission project, obviously along with a whole bunch of other wind farms out there. But every time I get in the car and drive south from home, I'm driving right through that opposition to that AusNet project. It's pretty confronting. You know, it doesn't matter which route you drive, there's piss off AusNet signs, you know, all the way through that. It's confronting. And even talking to local neighbours at Kayada, it's 3 hours from where that transmission project is. But on behalf of farmers in Victoria, they've already got it in their mind that the project's a bad idea and that they're opposed to it regardless of their views on Kayada locally. So I see the transmission stuff is really hard. You've talked about it, Charlie just had some comments at the end there. But how do you turn those transmission projects around? How do you give them agency if the local community have decided that it's black and white and they don't want big transmission lines across their paddocks? How do you turn that around? And I guess it feels like it becomes a much bigger question around infrastructure, not just for the wind industry. The wind farms have got lots of revenue, lots of positive stuff to share. But transmission projects start to look like a whole bunch of other state infrastructure projects. Are we going to have every infrastructure project needing to start sharing financial benefits with the people in the area? So really interested in how we're going to turn the transmission discussion around, because it feels like a huge risk to those renewable energy zones and the transformation for the next 10 years.
It's a great question. Pretty easy. I just want to see who would like to speak to that.
I think Ben might have
I reckon Ben's got some things to say about that.
I mean, I do too, but I'm happy for Ben to go first.
It is, as I hope in my opening message flagged, it is a fundamental challenge. And again, that's why I think we just need to have that more elevated, considered, sort of mature discussion publicly about what are we aspiring to as a society, and how do we work that back and identify the trade-offs, because transmission is absolutely fundamental to an energy transformation. And I think there are lots of innovations and there are lots of existing platforms by which we can share benefits with landowners, with communities, with industry, and then more broadly, see our country's economy be stable, resilient and prosperous. And I don't think we will get that without that level, mature, whole of society conversation. I think it's at the moment still very much in its infancy. We're dealing with project by project, sort of case by case conflict resolutions. We're not elevating that up to a whole reform discussion. And give you an example, and there are fair and reasonable questions that come from landowners, come from communities more broadly, particularly with transmission. Why do you need to build it overhead? Why can't you build everything underground? And they're legitimate and fair questions. But I guess that is the opening question too, to a more mature and nuanced discussion about trade-offs of performance and reliability, trade-offs of impact, trade-offs of cost and time delay. And I think we also just need to step back, understand the urgency of the challenge ahead of us, understand technically, environmentally and socially what needs to get done when. And there will always be winners and losers, unfortunately, but how do we buffer and support those who feel they bear the cost and impact and bring that burden up to a level of fairness and equity? And I think I can see a future where we get that right. And I think, though, there is a role for government to bring that more nuanced, mature discussion, facilitate and coordinate these developments to meet those relatively urgent timeframes, but deliver those lasting, meaningful benefits, which as a business and as a project, we're absolutely committed to.
Great. Thanks, Ben. So this, Andrew, I'll just give you a chance to, I know you're itching to finish off here. We're pretty much out of time, so we'll just
okay. I will keep it
this.
very, very brief.
Yep.
I think that thanks for that question, Phil. It's a good one. That Western Victorian project is, look, let's call a spade a spade. It's in a world of pain at the moment, and there's some quite simple reasons. And so the points that were made earlier around early and open engagement didn't happen with that project. It came out of the ISP as a plan. AEMO did all the work to try to get it all, get it all through the RIT-T, but none of that community engagement took place at that early stage. So, you could kind of see it coming, I think what we're looking at now, the ISP's got 12 projects or thereabouts, large transmission projects that need to go ahead. And the TNSPs who are tasked with building them haven't built projects of this scale, with the exception of one or two things in Queensland, for 30 or 40 years. So that kind of knowledge is not there. Also, it isn't the 1980s anymore. There's very different expectations in the country than there used to be. So there's a whole lot of things that we need to bring up to speed really quickly. And I think that Western Victorian project is an example of one that sort of went off a bit, half-cocked. And I think it's been a learning experience. Transgrid in New South Wales is discovering with some of their earlier things, they're having to reboot their community engagement, and that's a really important step that they're taking. So I think we need to see the sort of engagement techniques we're talking about in this session stepped up into the transmission space.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew. And I just asked, we out of time? Got one question.
We'll probably leave it for this.
All right. If you could all join me in thanking our panel members. Thanks to Ben and Charlie for dialing in. Thanks to Aaron and Andrew. And thanks to you all for a great conversation. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Ben. It's a pleasure.
So thank you for joining us this morning. We just have morning tea served at the expo area, so same as yesterday. So if you could visit that area, yeah, that'll be great. Thank you. Oh, selfie. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, selfie. You can
take it. It's just I think when you take it from down there, it's like super unflattering. All the lights and stuff. But maybe if you want to take one for us. I was going to try and get those guys to pick on. I don't know if that'll work.
So I'll have this side here. Yeah. Yeah. Have a look. Thanks. So I'm actually helping this
Just want to check if it works. It works. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Well, welcome back from morning tea, ladies and gentlemen. Great. I hope you had a nice refreshment. It gives me great pleasure in introducing the first of three of our keynote speakers today. Casper Thorhort, I hope I've got that right, Casper, and I haven't embarrassed you or me. He is the CEO of Star of the South project, which we heard a little bit about earlier this morning with the Chief Development Officer on stage, Erin Coldham. Casper really needs no introduction. I'm sure some of you might have seen him on TV or read about him in the papers. He's the CEO, Star of the South project, has extensive experience in the offshore energy industry, has developed and delivered a number of offshore projects both in Europe and Asia, totaling more than $10 billion. He holds a number of senior roles and board positions at one of Denmark's biggest energy companies and has led large teams across multiple global offices. He's led the multi-billion-dollar 900 megawatt Greater Chongho 1 project and 2A offshore wind farms in Taiwan. He's also successfully led the construction of a 465 megawatt offshore wind farm in Germany and gained financial backing for 3 offshore wind projects totaling more than 200 megawatts over the last decade. Very impressive. Casper is recognised as a rising talent in the offshore wind industry, and we are absolutely delighted that you can join us here today and welcome you to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming and listening to the story of Star of the South. And thank you so much for the very kind words that almost made me embarrassed. So, yes, it's good. So maybe just start with acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet today and pay our respects to the elders past, present, and future. So I thought it was always good kind of introducing who am I and how did we get to where we are today. And for me, I've been working with offshore wind for quite a long time, over 10 years. And before that, I did have a job as a consultant at a time where I did energy modeling for the EU Union, for EU commissioning. And one of the scenarios we did was modeling how much offshore wind will there be in the future in Europe. And one of the scenarios was actually putting turbines everywhere in the North Sea, which made a pretty big laugh for most stakeholders. They thought that was the most ridiculous idea they ever heard about, putting turbines everywhere in the North Sea. The picture you see on the left here is 10 years later, and I was literally standing out there seeing turbines as far as the eye could see. There was multiple offshore wind farms. This is in Germany, and we were building the next one that was coming online for my company at the time. It was the third project to be built in Germany. So sometimes it does happen that you do a crazy modeling and it's very, very quickly turns into reality. The is one of the reasons why I'm also here today is, there is a technology that is also very, very good conditions here in Australia to be realized, and that is offshore wind. And we would like to present a solution for how it could be the first project to be built in Australia. I've been here more than 2 years now since I moved from Europe with my family, and the family is shown here on the picture. And it's been a very exciting journey. And offshore wind has been accepted and acknowledged to a far greater degree than when I arrived. And it's just a testimony that we are having Erin earlier today on the panel, that we get to do a speech and you want to hear it. And also that we have a panel debate later on offshore wind. It is starting to be acknowledged also. So thank you for that. If we start from kind of say, what is offshore wind, and we go from the global side of it, we have here kind of data from last year. I'll just present it first, and you see a quite dramatic growth in what is one of the fastest growing technologies in the world. Offshore wind is a global industry now. It took its origination from Denmark and moved into the northern countries in Europe, especially in UK and Germany, which has really driven the technology by investing into it. And we see here that within this decade, we are actually foreseeing that we'll have up to 234 gigawatts of projects being built. That number is from last year in August, and I'm already now concluding that that's outdated. We have significant countries committing to a larger number since then. One example is you have US committed to 30 gigawatts of offshore wind to be built by the end of the decade. You have UK that's upscaled to 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by end of the decade. And on top of that, we have the whole Asia Pacific region that's really moving ahead quickly. So this industry is foreseen to be one of the main drivers of the transition to renewable power, if you look at a global scale. And we are very happy to be here today. This is our owners. Star the South is owned by Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, and also have the original founders as part of the ownership still. As you can see from SIP's portfolio here, we call Copenhagen Infrastructure for SIP, it's easier. They have multiple, and this is only their offshore wind portfolio of projects, where you see we have a presence in North America, in Europe, and all over Asia Pacific as we speak, and also here in Australia. We see a lot more emerging markets coming, and this map will look different only next year, where we see even more countries committing to this journey. Then maybe the question is, why did we choose to do offshore wind in Australia? And we're all here because we're talking about a transition. We have a big need, which is the current generation is ending its lifetime, and a decision needs to be made of what is to replace that existing generation. We believe that offshore wind offers a very attractive proposal to be part of the mix. And I think that's a key point we'll also touch upon here in the presentation, that a mix is very key for how the new generation profiles are built. If you look into a little bit the details here, it is offshore wind tends to be able to be built at a large scale. Out at sea, we have more area, which is, we can basically say we are going in at a large utility scale. Why also start this out is a 2.2 gigawatt project. There's also more strong and consistent winds offshore. There's less disturbance from land and trees. So you get a more consistent wind speed, which gives a higher capacity factor of the wind farm. And of course, there's also less conflicts with land users as you're not building on land. But of course, we also get new stakeholders when you build that at sea. But it offers that attractive alternative to diversify your portfolio. If we then look at how are you building Australia's wind industry, so we are acknowledging we are building Australia's first offshore wind farm, but we actually have the ambition to do more. We also want to be pioneering an industry in the country. And the last 6 months, 12 months has been tremendously exciting, where we are now seeing multiple projects all over the state, which the map just showed before. And we also in Victoria have more projects being proposed. So what we've been doing for a long time is tell the story of offshore wind. What are the benefits, and how can it be used? And luckily, we have had people wanting to listen to our story and the rationale of the project. So 2 weeks ago, after, of course, a lot of other important milestones, but this one being a key one, the federal government passed through the parliament the bill that will allow an offshore wind farm to be developed, constructed, and operated. We are still together with the government, of course, supporting them in developing the regulation that is needed to get all the approvals, but this is a significant step forward that is accepted as a technology that needs to. Then also on this one, you see our Premier Daniel Andrews and Energy Minister Lily Ambrosia, which we are very happy to say that we 2 weeks ago entered a partnership with to develop a scope covering 43.1 million Australian dollars over the next 1.5 to 2 years of work, which enables us to accelerate our activities and develop this project to be part of a solution for the future. I'm keeping a good speed, and that's on purpose because I was asked to make room for questions. So if you have questions later, you are more than welcome to come back to them. Maybe just a bit of few slides on what is Star the South. So Star the South is, as said before, a 2.2 gigawatt project. It's based in Gippsland, off the coast in Bass Straits. Some of the nearest towns are Port Albert. We also have announced our onshore transmission route, and as Erin alluded to in the panel discussion, we take community sessions quite important. We don't see us as being here to just tell the story, but we are actually wanting to be part of the community because a wind farm like this will exist for 30 years. So it's not getting the approval, but it's actually staying here for the long run. So we are handing in an application for being part of such a community for the long run. We are looking to build up to 200 turbines. The turbines will depend on the wind and the soil and all these things. So when we know the conditions out there and we know the supply chain, we will choose which size of turbine we'll deploy on the site. But we are up to 200. Our connection point will be in the Latrobe Valley, and as you can also see on the onshore route transmission line here. Then timing is always a good questions. Here are some generics. The first thing you do is, there needs to be a market. Then you need to test the feasibility, both from a market perspective, but also from a technical perspective. And then you start developing of the project when you start checking some of these key milestones. Then you take a financial investment and you go into construction, which we, for offshore wind, kind of had indicated what are the durations here. Feasibility development, 3 to 6 years, construction, 3 to 6 years, and then operation of the wind farm, 25, 35 years, and then decommissioning at one point in time. It's a bit early to talk about, but it's part of the planning of the project, which can take 2 to 3 years. For us, more concretely, we are very well progressed in the development of the project, and we hope and expect to have the approvals we need and be able to take an investment decision by mid of this decade. And if wind farm should be well and solidly in commercial operation before end of this decade. Of course, conditions on this being a new technology, so the schedule is a little bit more uncertain than a proven technology where you can use experiences from other projects. Then maybe just also a little bit, there is a strong rationale specifically for Victoria also, but it's the same case for all other markets, is why should you build offshore wind here? And it's to a large degree diversification. We need all the technologies that's present even at this conference. We need solar, we need onshore wind, we need offshore wind, because the need for power generation is so substantial that we need to find all the technologies. But that in itself has a strength. The diversification of using different weather patterns is a key one. As this map shows, a majority of the current projects being developed and have been developed is in the western part of Victoria, which is exposed to the same weather pattern. By using the eastern side of the states, you are exposed to a different weather pattern, which is clearly a strength and making the whole portfolio of renewable technologies more reliable. If you then look offshore for our projects, we actually did a very interesting study together with BOM over 30 years of data. We see that when you have very hot days in Melbourne, where the grid and the whole demand system is under the most stress it gets, there is the same weather phenomenon that's causing it, and that blows very strong winds over our sites and in Bass Strait. So actually, when the power is most needed, we have some of our highest availability of the wind farm, which again creates that diversity and that strength, and why you want to diversify your generation profile as a country and as a state. So we could have started with this one, but I thought it was good to come with it a little bit later when you get the story of why. But here is also what is an offshore wind farm made of, and that is it's naturally built on turbines. It's a bit different. The turbines is offshore, and I'll show a few pictures in a moment of how you actually install the wind farm offshore. But you install the wind farm up to 200 units offshore, a lot of sea cables, and you will be under the seabed, 1.5 meters or something like that, and that's transported into an offshore substation where the voltage is increased up to 225, 275, depending on the technology that's chosen at the moment, and that is exported into land. And we will have an onshore substation close to shore, and we will have an onshore substation closer to the grid connection point. And you will also see here on the slide, we have committed to building underground cables for the project as long as it's technically feasible, and it has less impact than if we chose a different solution, which means we do expect our transmission line to be underground. Then if you look at the turbine technology, and I said up to 200 turbines, but it depends on which one of those we choose. And this is just to show that there is a rather big difference between onshore turbines and offshore turbines. And one of the obvious things is it's a lot larger. There's also other technologies inside the turbine, because when you're standing outside at sea, you need to deal with the sea air, salt and other things that will corrode and other processes. So you actually need to marinize the different turbines. So the industry is developing offshore specific turbines. For our side, we're looking to deploy a turbine between 12 to 18 megawatts on the site. We expect this to be the relevant technology for the time frame we are looking. And as you can see, they have a considerable height as well. Then here are some of the operation that's going on. The vessels on the left side here is a foundation installation. You can see just barely that there is a pile, a black can pile sticking up of the water, and it's because it's just been driven into to the seabed. The middle, or the picture in the center, is the turbine installation vessel. All of the vessels we'll use will be jack-up vessels as this. So it will typically have 4 legs and go out of the sea to get a stable platform before it starts lifting these very heavy objects. And then we will also have a mix of crew boats and SOV vessels in the site, depending on the operation. Ports and harbors, that goes without say, that is a very close partnership. When you build an offshore wind farm, with the amount of components we need to get out and the considerable sizes these units have, both foundations and the turbine, ports are very important. Luckily, there are very good ports in our region and generally in all of Australia. So that gives a lot of possibilities for how to deploy it. But one of the, for example, part of the workshop, the work streams we have with the Victorian government in the partnership we have entered, is to enter into more concrete discussions of how such a setup will look in Victoria to just develop this industry, and having a lot more detailed discussion with the ports and harbors. There's a difference between ports and harbors for construction, which is the one you see on the picture, and ports and harbors for O&M and the operation of the lifetime. Good. Just a little bit on what we have been working on for the project. So in 2019, something important happened for us. The federal government with Minister Angus Taylor awarded us an exploration license, which basically have been what we are standing on today and building the project on and have been able to do. So we started out by deploying a FLIDAR, which is measuring the wind and the wave conditions at site. And that has been there for close to 2 years by now. And that is very strong and important that you know the conditions out at sea before you can build your wind farm. Then in 2020, we started referral of our project to kick off the environmental assessment of the project. And we also started the environmental surveys. From a technical perspective, we did the geophysical survey. So we now have a reasonably good understanding of the seabed out there and can conclude that we believe the site is very feasible for the purpose we have. Then here in 21, we have continued the environmental surveys. They are conducted over 2 years. And also we have started the scoping of the project. And then we can now check the box of having agreed with stakeholders and having it out in public that the project is scoped. Here's just a few pictures of what it actually means to kind of do the environmental assessment of the project, where we are doing aerial surveys. Here we are tagging seal and birds, and this is just examples of how this is our underwater and marine ecology surveys and how it looks when we do the surveys. And here is where we are in the time schedule. So as said, scoping is completed, and we are at the number 3 step, which is preparing our environmental impact statements for the project, where we have committed to doing 25 reports and studies to be handed into authorities. Then we are also, as Erin alluded to, so I'll do that a bit quick, as Erin just had the chance of explaining our strategy to this. But we are working very closely with the community and hope to be accepted as part of the community for the lifetime of this project, and also the traditional owners and land owners of landholders of our land. And these are some of the pictures of how we conducted, and we believe that the idea and the purpose of why going to use the strong resources of the coast of Gippsland and continuing the proud history that Gippsland and Latrobe Valley have had for more than a century of being the home of power generation in Victoria, that this technology offers that possibility of continuing simply that industry. And also the skilled workers within the power sector and the skilled people in the oil gas sector from Bass Strait actually fits directly into the skills we need to build to have an offshore wind industry. I myself come from the power plant sector, used to work with coal and biomass plants, and I was hooked up together with people from oil and gas to form what is now some of the early people entering this industry. And we expect and hope to be able to do the same here in Gippsland. So what are we up to for 22? And that is we are preparing our environmental statements. One of the very exciting things is also our geotechnical investigations, which we are happy we can now kick off and accelerate as part of the partnership with the government. This gives us a lot more detailed understanding of what the soil conditions are, and we can then start the engineering part of the project once that has been completed. And as said before, ports and harbors, and then engineering design. So we are kind of entering the development phase of the project and the assets. That was a bit what I planned to say today. I hope it was not too quick, but I hope I left a little bit for questions as requested. If you want to follow us, and the grades up here on the slide are some tags, how to follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook. And we encourage you to do so because we try to stay active there and share where we are with the project.
So we've got time for a couple of questions. So thank you so much, Casper. I think you've given a fantastic presentation of the developments going on with your project. So I think we've got a question over there.
Hi there. Stephen Lenihan from Alkalizer Technology. Really interesting project, obviously very innovative and breaking new, I won't say ground, but water. I was just curious because obviously the Danes have got a lot of experience in offshore development and wind farms. What do you see as the three biggest challenges to getting this wind farm operational in 4 years, considering Australia's unique challenges? And I suppose the follow-on would be, what percentage would you sort of lay out in terms of meeting that deadline, considering this will be Australia's first offshore project?
It's a good question. I'll refrain from putting percentages on, but I'll try to make it, try to explain what are the chances and the risk we see on the project. The regulatory framework is clearly not developed, so we need to meet some management plans that needs to be signed off and approved. NOPSEMA, who has been appointed the regulator, needs to have the ability to actually develop this framework and assess projects up against it. We're very encouraged by the strong focus that NOPSEMA have already put on it together with DISA. They are working hard on it, and we are happy that we as an industry are questions and providing feedback. That is the most we can hope and ask for to be part of the process. So that does encourage us to hope that the schedule in these regards are realistic. Then other challenges are, of course, our environmental assessment of the project. We need to just demonstrate an asset like this out at sea in Australia is acceptable from an impact point of view. It's never been done before, so it takes a little bit extra time. But we have a very strong strategy. We, over the last year and two, have agreed with both the federal and the state, because the project is in both waters. So it's in state and waters, and in federal water. Only the cable is in state waters. And then, of course, we have our onshore transmission line. So we need both approvals, but it's going well. But we acknowledge that it's a new thing, and people need extra time to understand it. And we believe we have catered for that in our schedule. Our confidence is that the project is in principle funded all the way to financial close. So the funds has been raised to realize this project, and also actually for executions if we meet the right deadlines. So our investors believe in the project.
Thank you very much for the presentation and the updates on the project. I've got a question from the perspective of the offshore infrastructure, right? So there's a lot of discussion on the turbines and how the technology is progressing. And you mentioned the 200 turbines of 12 to 18 megawatts. So the question is in relation to the substations and how the substations technology is progressing, and the number of substations and specs that you are expecting that will service the project.
Yes, so substations, the offshore substations. So on land, we will have two. That's also been communicated. I think we have a little bit of flexibility in our environmental assessment of the project. If you look at offshore, we are keeping a flexibility up to 4 offshore substations to optimize the layout of the wind farm. But you could, in principle, also consider 1 offshore substation. It comes a little bit about the supply chain. What are they able to handle? If it's only 1 substation, it gets really, really big. If it's 2 or 4, it makes it a different proposal. And it also depends on lead time. If you have 1 manufacturer to develop 1 substation, the lead time is longer. Whereas if you develop it out to more manufacturers, you have a higher security on meeting the deadline. So that is a decision that's based on discussion with the supply chain, and when we have chosen the turbine, and we more closely how the wind farm is going to be laid out. So we also optimize the array cabling between all the wind farms. So all the turbines need to come into the substation, and we need to ensure we do that cost effective.
Thank you.
Have you got time for one more question?
Okay. Yeah.
One more question. All right. So there's a question right down there at the end of the room, the back of the room.
So we have done studies and investigation into this at an early stage of the project, and for our project and this site we have and where we have the connection point, AC is the most desirable solution, and that is the solution we have committed to develop, and is also the only one we have included in our environmental assessment of the project. So we are not looking at DC.
All right, well, we will move on to the next session. I want to thank you though, Casper. Can you please join me in thanking Casper? Wonderful. Terrific to hear your update on the developments of the project, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge on an Australian first here in the Convention Centre. Now we would like to turn to our next session, and it's entitled Streamlining Project Construction and Reducing the Uncertainty. And our moderator for this session is Brad George. He's a partner at ERM. He's also a senior planner and environmental practitioner who is focused on advising clients on planning approvals and environmental impact assessment for more than 20 years. He's also worked on a number of projects in the Asia Pacific and Middle Eastern regions. Welcome, Brad, to the stage.
Thanks, everyone. Good morning to you. Fantastic update from Casper also on the south and what the local offshore industry looks like here in Australia. It's exciting times as a consultant advisor. Just very quickly, ERM's very pleased to be in attendance in today's session. We have global involvement in the wind energy sector and advising clients to the order of about 16 gigawatt of capacity here in Australia. Today's session, streamlining project construction and reducing uncertainty, I think of relevance to hopefully all in the room. And to get us started, we've got good representation from consultant advisors, EPC, project managers, and turbine foundation design expertise. Andre, I hopefully have that right for Pico. So we'll jump straight into panel Q&A. We're hoping to reserve 5 minutes or so for questions at the back end of the session. So please, give thought to any queries you might have. If the panel wants to join us, we have 4 in person and we have 1 team member from WA, Robert Seek, who I might start introducing. Robert's from GHD in Perth. Robert's a Technical Director and Market Development Lead for GHD's APAC Future Energy Practice. He's responsible for projects and clients and advocating technical authority for the benefit of GHD's clients and technical partners in the Australian wind energy sector. Robert has over 25 years of experience in the power industry as an EPC contractor and consultant. He led GHD's owner's engineer team services for the recently commissioned Warradage wind farm in WA. Robert holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and master's in environment from the University of Technology, Sydney. He holds a CP Eng, is a fellow of the Australian Institute of Energy and member of the UTS School of Engineering's Professional Advisory Board. Welcome, Robert. Not sure whether you can see us. Julian Gashenow from Downer. Julian has over 20 years of experience in the engineering sector, working for developers, engineering consultants and contractors, the power and water sectors. Julian started by developing wind farm projects in Europe in the early 2000s before moving to Australia in 2004, working for Acciona Energy, then engineering firms Insura and GHD, leading their energy teams. He's currently General Manager for Downer Engineering, managing over 200 people nationally. Julian brings a mix of technical and commercial expertise to the discussion. Dr. Katrina Swalwell from Oricon has over 20 years experience in wind energy, from fundamental research to leading technical assessments for major wind farm developments through APAC. Her experience includes 10 years working for a wind turbine manufacturer, leading a team responsible for optimisation of wind farms to improve the levelised cost of energy, turbine site suitability assessment, power and noise guarantees, and testing and assessments of operational wind farms. Since joining Oricon almost 2 years ago, she's enjoyed working with multidisciplinary teams to provide clear answers to complex technical questions across the development, construction, operation and decommissioning of wind farms. Katrina has a particular interest in end-of-life strategies for wind farms and is chair of the Clean Energy Council Wind Directorate's Recycling Group. And Katrina and the Oricon team keep the life cycle of the project in mind during construction to maximise the long-term value of the project. Andrei Nobovic from Pico, our sponsor here, is an experienced business leader with a high level of know-how in precast production and has construction project management experience in energy infrastructure projects and prefab construction across Northern and Eastern Europe, Kazakhstan and South Korea. Andrei holds a bachelor's degree in production of precast products, a master's degree in energy physics and an MBA in innovation management, with a solid foundation for learning and implementing new solutions for wind applications. Andrei's worked with Pico since 2010. Before relocating to Melbourne in 2020 as Pico's APAC Business Development Manager, Andrei was working in South Korea for 3 years as Business Development Director. Now his main concentration is business development for onshore wind farms across Australia on technology and business-wise, particularly providing solutions for a faster, safer and more efficient way to design and build foundations for onshore wind turbines. And finally, Rob Bryant from N8. Rob joined N8 in March 2018 as Executive Vice President, Asia Pacific, and Rob is responsible for sales and general operations of N8 through the Asia Pacific region. Before joining N8, Rob was Director of Operations for ECI Solutions, leading sales and operations for its Australian business. Previous to that, he was Chief Operating Officer with Teambinder, as it secured the use of its system on over $100 billion worth of projects, including numerous government infrastructure projects and contractors from across the globe. Prior to that, Rob was General Manager for IBIS World Business Information. Rob started his career in London, working in marketing and public relations, following an education that switched from database management to communications. Rob has led sales and operations for a range of cloud-based product and service organisations with significant experience in leading high-growth software business servicing the construction and engineering sector. Away from the office, Rob enjoys running over short course knowledge and growing children. Probably left us 5 minutes for Q&A here, but you'll know the panel very well. So I'm your timekeeper. I can't reach people to kick them under the desk, but here we go. 5 questions we're going to put the panel. Hopefully a bonus question again, but again, hopefully keeping that 5 minutes for questions from the floor. So prompt me when we're getting pretty close. So going to throw to Julian first. Julian, what design innovations could be considered to reduce construction and projects?
Hi, Brad. Thanks for the question. Yeah, look, I think from construction, main challenges that we're going to see is of the wind turbine. There's been a lot of evolution on the wind turbine itself, on the blade, on the size of the wind turbine, getting to 5 megawatt, 6 megawatt plus. So, but really from a balance of plant, the design and the construction has not changed very much from the way it was 20 years ago when I started. So, and that's a challenge because of the size of the new wind turbine and the size of the foundation in particular is going to be a big challenge. So all the gravity foundation that are being done on a 5 megawatt wind turbine, you just think about the size and the time it takes to pour them. So I think that the innovation design point of view is to focus on the foundation aspect, and I'll talk a lot more about it, but we got to look at a different way of constructing those big pads, because I think it's getting to almost 1,000 cubic square, and the time it's going to take, the risk involved in construction, because you've got to do it in one shot. Significant. As a basic, you got to look at transportation. We are seeing as well, but onshore I haven't really seen that a lot. So, but that will have to come because the length of the blade is not going to be able to be transported on the normal road that we have. So that's something that we have to be looked into. So it's really around looking at, because again, it's just been done the same way for the last 20 years, and something to change. From electrical point of view as well, from the reticulation point of view, again, it hasn't really changed a lot. And we're going to need to look at the voltage of the wind turbine as well. So offshore, I think they're looking at getting up to 66, which is really good. But on the onshore wind project, that's not being looked at yet. And what that means is really on one circuit, you can only put 3 or 4 turbines now with the size of the turbine. So you're going to have a lot of circuits coming into like the trenches and the roads. And that's going to be one of the challenge. So again, from an electrical point of view, we got to look at a different solution. We got to look at some optimization there. So we need some innovation from a balance of plant point of view that we haven't seen just because of the size of the turbine and the size of the projects.
Thanks, Julian. Hey, can I just get your thoughts on innovations that could be considered?
Thank you. So I will perspective because I'm professional deformation. My professional deformation lied to the concrete construction. And speaking about the wind, we was witness not even an evolution, but revolution of the wind industry as a machine, efficiency and scale. And we have a gap in our construction, technology, modeling, which is not yet a follow to such kind of rapid development. And I would say the most dominant changes in the next couple of years, I would say, I would not even mention about 5 years and 2 years, we will see more beam technology to be utilized for all entire model of wind farm construction perspective. We have already beam model utilized in custom situ residential and commercial. 3D modeling is not a tool only for construction and civil engineering. It's also adding 4th dimension as a lead time to the executed entire project. And complexity of the wind is exactly what we need to have to be utilized as a beam modeling in entire project, including foundation, towers, electrical part, and etc. Also, we will witness a different type of structure as a tower structure. I mean, I'm not touching OEM machine part, which is, and innovation which we witnessing in wind is like 20 or 50 years gap between, because we tried to build something which is not existed 10 years ago by utilizing technology which is 50 years old, because we call it safer solution. Some definition of saving construction perspectives that safer is the most repeated solution, what is not necessary true, especially if we're talking about towers structure which come in on the pipeline, which is not only steel tube, which is commonly dominating right now, but the break-even point of switching from the steel tube to the hybrid, implementing know-how from the precast, from post-tensioning precast solution, hybrid solution, even cable stay foundation or frame type of towers, which will come into the play, and the market break-even point area, because size of the turbine should be bigger. And even that much innovative solution, which sounds weird from my perspective today, it's also one of the solution is a timber structure to be utilized for the building towers. And all these give new challenges to foundation itself, how we respond, how we make it more efficient, how we build green energy in more greener way, because to cast it 1,200 cubic meter of gravity foundation is the equivalent of a 5-floor residential apartment in single day. and it's also have a huge CO2 footprint. And one of the dimensions that we need to take into account in our innovations portfolio, how to reduce CO2 footprint, because it will sooner or later, it's not a question if, it's a question when, this CO2 footprint will cost money for every one of us who are trying to build green energy, and we need to be a greener in construction as well.
Thanks very much, Andre. Robert C, hopefully your audio is working for you there, Rob. Keen for your views as a consultant advisor on the matter.
Thanks, Brad. Yes, I can hear you. Hopefully you can hear me. You want to give me just a thumbs up, just to yeah, great. Okay. Yeah, so calling from sunny WA here. So my thoughts, I guess my or our observations here at work on projects in WA, craneage, and I think Julian's touched on that and Andre's touched on that as well. We're going to be getting wind turbine towers bigger, higher. The cranes at the moment around industry, I mean, these are serious bits of kit that are required to sort of lift the sections of the tower into place. And what we've been seeing from some of the contractors, we've got a lot of, we've got a global footprint, some of their operations overseas, is that in constructing the towers now, they're looking to cranes that are, I guess, integrated with the tower itself, kind of like a crawler. If we know on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, sort of crane that's up there, that's sort of up there in perpetuity. But we're seeing those type of design innovations being considered. Haven't seen it yet in Australia, but certainly overseas, being considered in order to sort of avoid those cranes, which have probably reached their limit of scale to be able to construct these towers. So that's one trend as well, and that's also driven by, I guess, the safety aspect as well. I mean, again, high towers. I mean, typically you're building wind farms in windy places. And on windy days, you're sort of down tools and you stop until the wind dies down before you continue constructing. So it's addressing that safety element at that design stage, sort of bringing that safety design perspective as well. And one thing as well, we've seen, I guess, the application of LiDAR, or what we call forward-facing LiDAR, and something we've sort of seen tabled by some of the OEMs as well. In using that, not just during the operation stage, but during construction as well, to sort of forecast, when those gusts are coming, and be able to sort of react quickly as well. So I guess they're the observations I can share talking about design.
No, thanks so much, Rob. Rob Ryan, next one for you. So why aren't we seeing this type of innovation, and what are your thoughts on what's preventing it from happening?
I think if we look at our experience across industries, one of the challenges that I think this sector faces is getting that early engagement and involvement from consultants and contractors to bring innovation into the projects. We've seen that a lot in the infrastructure space, where we've been working for a number of years, and in those major projects, we're now starting to see more early contractor engagement, which is leading to more innovative solutions, particularly in the areas of tunneling and bridge building and even road building to a large extent. So I think the contracting structures are one of the things that can actually prevent innovation from being adopted on projects, and it's finding ways for all stakeholders to allow that to happen and encourage that innovation and collaboration as the industry evolves and as these projects continue to evolve so rapidly through the technology and the scale that colleagues on the panel here have been referring to. I think it's making room for that within the way that projects are structured, and bringing collaboration into it from the beginning.
Yeah, good one. Katrina, keen for your thoughts as a consultant advisor.
Thank you. I think one of the reasons we're not seeing is that the financing isn't allowing it. You're seeing a lot of projects. Obviously, you don't want to spend too much in the early stage of a project development. You want to make sure that the project is going to be financially viable when it's built. So you've got to limit your spend, and your spend goes to the high risk items, as we heard in the financing session at the beginning of today. High risk at the minute's grid and other things like that. The risk isn't seen there, or the opportunity isn't seen in things like taking detailed geotech measurements that are essential for doing a new foundation design and really understanding the site. So being able to justify spending that money early so that you can spend less money later, but it is that timing issue of where's the money available, when can we actually get that detailed information, and how long do we allow the contractors to have that information so they can come up back with innovative solutions.
Yeah, no, thanks, Katrina. Julian, if I can go to you, what are your thoughts on where does responsibility lie in reducing project uncertainty and risk in design and construction?
Yeah, well, I think it's a shared one. From a contracting point of view, we got to take some responsibility and some of the risk, but as Katrina said, it needs some time as well and needs the right information as well. So the developer also needs to put in the right amount of time and make some investment in terms of doing all the site studies, getting all the geotechnical information that is required to drive some of this innovation. Because very often as a contractor, we are asked to bid in a very short period of time. The site information is very weak, like at best. So that doesn't help us driving some solution there. So we often rely on geotech that is sparse. Even like the survey from the site is not always very good. So if you don't have the right information, if you don't have the right time, that obviously doesn't help to drive some innovation. So it needs some collaboration from the developer and the contractor and the designer, of course, working together, taking some time, looking at the risk allocation as well, because any innovation will drive some of the risk up as well, because you're going to introduce some new methodologies, new way of building things. So some of the risk will be there, and you need to be able to discuss as a contractor with the developer saying, okay, we're going to try to bring some innovation here. We're going to try to bring something new, looking at precast foundation or something like that. If you want to do these sort of things, it's going to take time. It's going to take some collaboration. And if you go through a normal cycle of like a tender, 4 to 6 weeks, it's not going to work. So this required months of interaction, working together. What sort of information do you need? What's the supply chain, for example, is, and how can we find a solution there? And what is the risk allocation between the different parties as well?
Thanks, Julian. Katrina, could we get your thoughts?
Yeah, I think what Rob was saying about different contracting models is really key there, so that you do have that time, so that you have a shared risk, share reward model, so that you can partner with the balance of plant contractors and really spend the time and figure out where there's some extra value that can be extracted. And the key here is really fitting the technology to the site. We all know how to build a road, but you're going to be a lot less costly road if you sit there and go, okay, which way do I take it so I've got less cut and fill? Which way do I take my foundation so that I can really take advantage of the ground conditions so that I have the most optimum solution? How do I use my wind turbines in the layout there so that I've got the best technology for the site and I take responsibility? We are farming here. We actually have to respond to them.
Thanks, Katrina. Rob Ryan, very interested in your take with software project management. How can you assist?
Yeah, I think it really comes back to that, how you facilitate the collaboration as much as anything. And around that question of risk and taking that out of the projects, I think it has to be very much a shared experience there. What we've seen in other sectors is where when that's done effectively and you've got the owners and all of the stakeholders collaborating and sharing that risk, and it's not pushed down onto the either contractors or the specialist services within the project who are left with less time and less budget and trying to respond to ever increasing project pressures, you get a better outcome. And I think being able to place that risk and seeing the reward come in the innovation and the outcome. I mean, I think it's well illustrated in the previous presentation with Star of the South. We've got a 25 to 35 year life on the operations for these projects. So spending time to get things right at the beginning and have adequate planning and adequate time to bring innovation in will pay off. It's just a question of how it's looked at to say, well, do we look for an immediate return, or do we look for getting a return over time for improved efficiency and innovation that you learn from on each project? Being able to bring that into subsequent projects. So one of the things we look at is how you apply AI in that respect. So, it's a really topical theme, but taking the learnings from previous projects and applying that to templates and providing insights and suggestions on how you can then approach similar projects in the future can go a long way to improving the outcomes in the end.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rob. Here's one that's close to home, and Rob Seek, hopefully you're ready. What role is there for environmental impact assessment and planning approvals in reducing risk and uncertainty during construction?
Heaps. I'll start with that word. Look, again, I guess drawing on our experiences here, the very nature, I guess, and when we're prospecting, when developers are prospecting for sites and looking for sites, some of these sites may have been used for military activity and bombing ranges, and I talk specifically about unexploded ordnance, for example. Some of the issues we've had, some projects our clients have had, and we've assisted them in their projects. Being, I guess, thorough across UXO to ensure that there are no surprises, and obviously the safety risk with that is immense during construction, is one, I guess, area that needs to be considered, that needs to be looked at carefully. When it comes to EIAs, Brad, and this obviously well enough as well, I guess the flora fauna aspects and bushfire management, etc., transport, all these sort of components that are required to be well understood and sort of articulated well before you start getting into design are important, because a lot of that, I guess, informs a approach to design. And again, the point I made earlier around sort of those safety aspects, safety design, and the stakeholder management part as well, absolutely key, absolutely important. Community perceptions, obviously you need community acceptance to build large projects. Selling that, and I guess painting that picture, articulating what's going to be built goes a long way to giving them comfort to so they can understand and be clear on what's being built, rather than affecting construction schedule and other sort of aspects as well. So yeah, look, I mean, there's a few aspects to that sort of stage even before going well into design. I guess planting the seeds of understanding the impacts of a large wind farm in a paddock that was probably designed to sort of graze and sort of address agricultural aspects and not sort of farm the wind. Yeah, I guess they're the sort of early thoughts. Yeah, that's probably it. Probably can go into more detail during the Q&A, but yeah, I guess a key bit in the development of a wind farm project.
Yeah. No, thanks, Rob. Probably appropriate to go to you, Julian. You and I had a discussion about 30 minutes ago. Probably an opportunity for you to get a few things off your chest as an EPC. But yeah, your thoughts.
No, look, I think it's the same topic at the end of the day. The more you can invest in the development phase, the more studies that you can do, the more certainty that you can have around what you're going to find on site, then the best it is, the less surprises you can have through the construction phase. So the more studies you have in terms of the, like the birds and the plants, the Aboriginal stuff that you can find, anything that can be surveyed, that can be, like identified and communicated to us is the best. And then as a contractor, obviously, we've got the responsibility to do like a good job on site as well. So it comes down to our own processes as well, make sure that we can identify where are the no-go zone, make sure that we manage that correctly on site. So the more information that we can have, the more certainty around like the risk is, then the best job that we can do. And then we take our share of responsibility through the construction phase. So it is really important that we do that. And also we sort of talked about just before around the involvement of the construction team as well through the DS studies as well, because often development are done based on a concept, and if the construction guys are not part of this, then it will be based on an approval that maybe can't be built as such. So when the contractors get involved, sometimes it is too late. You know, you've got an approval for like a route or for like an access tracks or things like that. Then, and the contractor comes on board and look at it, say, well, we can't build it that way. We're gonna have to go like around that hill. We're gonna have to go like a different way, and that can often create some tension, because obviously, maybe you have to update your planning approvals, or community like expectation might change as well. So involvement of the constructability, you know, side of things in the development phase is quite important as well, to minimize the risk of changes down the track.
So a nice big round table where the enviros sit with engineer designers and sit with the engagement team there as well.
That's right, in ideal world, that's right, everybody's happy.
Thanks, Julian. Katrina, keen for your views.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency in planning just to inherit a whole lot of planning decisions from previous projects. And there's a real reluctance to challenge the authorities and say, actually, things have changed. We're talking about bigger turbines now. We're going to need, you know, roads with different impacts. We're going to need bigger spacing between the turbines and bigger flexibility. There's the classic is we get 100 meters micrositing in most planning applications, which is great when you've got a 90 meter rotor diameter turbine. We're talking 170 meter rotor diameter turbines now. And the amount of spacing and optimization that you can get within that is quite limited. So we actually have to educate the planning authorities about what's different, what's changed from the projects they've seen previously, and what we're going to need to see to construct these ones efficiently and make sure that they're efficient and really good projects going forward.
Thanks, Katrina. Andre, come around to your turn, and I think as a technology provider designer, what role can technology play in minimising and balancing risk in decision making?
I would say digitalization and more smarter civil design. For example, if from a construction perspective, if we met a rock on site, it's a nightmare. From our perspective, is an opportunity to reduce concrete maybe 50 times, because we instead of going wider, we're going deeper. And this approach change the methodology of a construction process and techniques which we need to be involved. But at the end of the day, there is a room for cost efficiency and most important for CO2 efficiency and labor intensity, because now we're speaking about gigawatts of turbines to be built. And if I divide it by 5 or 6, I get hundreds or even 1,000 turbines to be built every year. And where these people will come from when we need to 25, 30 people for each foundation to be built, if we are speaking about gravity. So if we have a space for the rock solution, we have another application which will give us a more industrial way to build something which we get used to build in one way, and we have a space to make it's optimized in the many direction and I would say definitions, because break-even point this year is a completely different location compared to 1 year ago or 2 years ago when we're speaking about cost of construction and raw material availability.
No, thanks, Andre. Rob Ryan, your take.
Yeah, I think it's obviously really exciting area to think about when you consider all the lessons that can be learned and the evolution and the pace that things are moving at. Technology is clearly an enabler. I think from our perspective, when we look at projects like this, we see how technology can be used to develop more efficient planning and scheduling around projects and estimating. And it comes back to that collaboration point and making that information available to all the stakeholders on the project and involving more of that collaborative decision making as well, so that there's a more consultative process through the early phases of the project, and everyone gets the opportunity to understand the choices that are being made and the benefits in terms of outcome around those as well. So there's the data points that you can gather, and I think this is an industry is very good at gathering data points in terms of efficiency. So as projects continue to evolve, being able to take those in and use that data to help drive decision making for future projects is enormously helpful. And so as you approach those projects, even from a design and construction point of view, looking at that virtual build and going through all of those scenarios in a virtual capacity before you get on site, and being able to explore that so that when you do get on site, you can stick to your project to plan that a bit more efficiently and with more confidence, and ultimately deliver a better outcome by utilizing technology through the planning and the development phase, and then gathering that data through the operations, and then the cycle continues. And I think that's where we've seen other industries utilize technology, other sectors of engineering and construction. I think the wind sector here has an enormous opportunity to do that for these projects as they continue to scale up.
Yeah, good one. Thanks, Rob. Rob Seek, your thoughts?
So technology. So I'm applying the sort of lens here upstream on the designer's table. So we've got access to a whole suite of nifty wind modelling packages, and I think sort of we've got the standard ones that we use across industry. Consultant engineers, got access to like a WindPro and whatnot. But I think with the emergence of big data that was sort of mentioned there, digital twins, I think we're going to start seeing some of these wind packages being really multi-dimensional, and in terms of sort of incorporating costing, scheduling, resourcing, quantities and whatnot. I mean, I think the example that if I can sort of leverage here, Revit in the business in the building industry, it's a highly intelligent sort of building information model. In the same way, I think we're going to start seeing some of these packages really evolving and being able to do more on the emergence of digitalisation, and that's just going to help, I think, make more smarter decisions and informed decision making.
Thanks, Rob. Been so good and too efficient running us through the program here. So we've got time. We do have time for the bonus question. I think we've probably got 5 minutes for the panel before we open up 5 minutes to the floor. Whoever wants to jump in first? You don't have buzzers, unfortunately, but do alternative energy projects have an inherent objective to be more sustainable in construction and operations? Who wants to go?
I'll take that one first.
Thanks, Katrina.
Yeah, look, we've seen what happened in America, where we've seen blades being dumped at the end of the life of a wind farm. And what's that? That's sort of the community reaction to that. There is a really high expectation of clean green energy, that it will be clean and green across its life cycle. So we are judged to a higher bar than some other industries, and we're going to have to meet that to continue to have that social license.
From construction perspective or design perspective, I would add that there is definitely needs for us to move more CO2 friendly when we're building green energy. So it's whatever procedure we're utilizing, we need to take into account as one of dimensions, and it will be game changer in the next 4 or 5 years wherever our government will decide to implement taxation. It's just a question when it will happen. It's not a question if, and we need to be preparing for adapting for this and be agile for such kind of innovations and already starting from now. Otherwise, it will be more painful and costly later on.
Yeah, no, look, I do agree, and if you look at the technology, maybe from like a foundation or the wind tower point of view, I think there's a lot that can be done as well. Look at the steel, whether you can get some green steel, maybe for the tower, that could be one option, I think we need to look at those options because as we're saying, there is an expectation that we can do better from that point of view.
Yeah, I'd say there's no doubt. And again, what we're seeing is a trend from other industries, particularly any that are related to the energy sector, is being able to track and measure that and make that a key data point in the project. So being able to track the sources of materials and being able to report on that through the project lifecycle is really important in terms of that stakeholder and community visibility, transparency, and trust. And so I think it's got an absolute place, and being able to communicate that is going to be critical.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Rob Seek, do you have anything you wanted to add there?
I think to Rob's point, I think the wind industry, I guess, and the whole sort of renewable industry as well, is going to follow the trends made elsewhere. So we're talking sustainability. All the sort of cranes running around on site will probably be battery powered or fuel cell powered at some point in the future. The other, I guess, aspect like that as well, wind repowering. It's utilising existing infrastructure and existing site. So I guess in thinking about repowering a project, you're not actually looking for another site, or land and to develop another project. So I think from a sustainable perspective, reusing what's already there to some extent, in that sort of repowering theme, would certainly be incumbent on us to look at. And I think that trend's coming here eventually. It's certainly happening overseas in North America. It's a matter of time, I think, before it comes here.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. We've got a few minutes before we'll open up to the floor, but just invite the panel for any key takeaways that all you wanted to add.
Yeah, I'd say really it starts at the beginning of the project. From our perspective, looking at how projects operate and to reduce uncertainty is a question you have to ask at the beginning. And what we always see is that projects don't fail in terms of budget or timeline at the end. They really fail at the beginning. It's where there isn't adequate time provided to come up with a realistic schedule and a realistic budget, and to take in all those considerations with the outcome in mind. So I think the key takeaway from me would certainly be to take time at the beginning to bring all parties together and really invest in a collaborative approach with an outcome in mind.
Absolutely, as an enviro, couldn't agree with you any more. Andre,
I would say that the collaboration is a key word, and collaboration not only about stakeholders who are involved in the particular project, industry collaboration, because when we're talking about innovations, many times in many cases we may meet situation when this technology already have been used somewhere. Just we need to put it in the wind applications perspective. That something what is completely new for wind or for construction could be existing for 150 years in mining as a drilling speed construction or tensioning or rock anchors or etc. Or precast is the longest industry in the world which we exist in, but we are not yet brave enough to utilize it. And it means that across industry collaboration is a key point for optimization and meeting new challenges which we have never met before. And the reason is size.
Yeah. Thanks, Andre. Katrina, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that point about learning lessons from other industries and also learning from ourselves. We're going to put in a lot of projects in the next few years. It's really important that we get that knowledge and we apply it and we improve, because we need to accelerate the rate of change and the amount that we build here.
Yeah, look, from like a contracting point of view, I think it's really the risk allocation, making sure that it's right and having a good conversation around who's taking which risk and the early engagement of the contractors. So from the development phase, having a contractor involved through the design phase as well. So the earlier we can get involved, the better we can look at the solution, the more innovation we can drive as well. So collaboration, I think, is one of the key words that we all say somehow.
Thanks, Julian. Rob C, any key takeaways before we go to the floor?
So me being the final sort of key commentator, collaboration. I think we've all mentioned it here. I think that's essential, especially when it comes to sort of innovation, applying it to design, applying it to reduce construction risk, reduce project risks, having enviros together in a room, the engineers, construction managers, it all makes sense, all sort of around and understanding what's going on. And then, using innovations from a safety and design perspective, I think key takeaway for me on that safety, from a safety aspect of the building. You know, I mean, the future of wind is going to be bigger, you know, taller, bigger capacity, you know, inherent risks building these things. Everybody wants to go home at the end of the day. So understanding that, you know, we need to be safe, and you know, construction needs to be as safe as possible to ensure that. This is one of the key messages.
Yeah, good one. No, thanks, Rob. I'll thank the panel, and probably given us 4 minutes if there's any questions to the panel from the floor.
Yeah, hi, Pedro Vizen from Res here. This one's for Julian. Just wondering how you think is the best way to work out early contractor engagement in our current scenario, which is mostly, you know, EPC for EPC contracts led by the turbine OEMs.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. The EPC model can still work, I think, but having the contractor being involved at the last minute is a challenge. So we have to, first the OEM has to pick like a contractor. So imagine the developers go pick, you know, like a wind turbine, have to find like a contractor. So we really come at the last minute, at the very end of the process. So there's nothing really stopping from the developer from working with a contractor from the start. And even if it's not a blank check saying we're going to use you till the end, at least having some engagement. And I've got to say, we are already starting to work with some developers on the concept design, looking at their environmental studies and so on. So some developers are already thinking that way. So it's not necessarily new, but that's really like important. So engaging us early on through the site studies, through the environmental studies, looking at how the site can be built, what's the best way to get into the site with the roads, the cranes, all the reticulation problem that you can have as well. So getting us involved early on is really key. And again, it doesn't mean that we're going to be involved all the way through, and you can still have your tender process down the track, but we can still have a look at the projects early on.
Right. Nick Rank, you mentioned roads. You know, you've got a centre line. You can. Oh, it's working. Centre line, and you can microsite your turbines and roads within 100 metres. That was pretty good when it came in, probably 10 years ago. The planning authorities like certainty. You know, they don't actually don't like the 100-metre ability. What's the answer to micrositing?
Well, I think it's explaining to the planning authorities what it looks like to have a greater than 100-metre micrositing on a large turbine wind farm. What you're doing when you put larger turbines on, you're increasing the spacing between them. So the visual impact is different than a smaller 2 megawatt size turbine. So there isn't that, if you can sit there and show them exactly what that's going to look, you know, this is what it looks like if we put them all where we're planning to. This is what happens if we shuffle them all around a bit. It's not a huge difference in the effect on the residents nearby. So it's about explaining that concept and explaining what that means in terms of the efficiency of the project and the cost of energy at the end.
Hi. I'm Risa Clout from Ostermark Routing. Our head office is in Denmark, and we've been working in the industry for more than 25 years doing onshore and offshore grouting. So we see a lot of things on the ground. I'm probably going to say a few contentious things about this topic about streamlining construction and innovation. So there's a lot of, I suppose, new projects with a lot of new people that are entering the industry for the first time, coming from other industries. we tend to be down the line in the construction phase, but at a pointy end where the cranes can't continue on unless we do our work. And what we see, particularly with foundations, is that they're not quite built in accordance with probably the design that they're intended. And then when we ask the question of what happened here, how did this get signed off, because it's going to impact some of the work we do, the problem that the BOP contractors have is they say, well, that's built in accordance to Australian standards. And so I guess my question is, it's wind farm construction is construction, it's same, but different. Have you seen, I suppose, a need to look at Australian standards for the wind farm construction industry in order to, I suppose, help with getting things signed off in a way that's going to be a better quality, less cost, less rework in the projects?
Yeah, being involved in writing technical specs and reviewing technical specifications, yeah, you often do see things that are not just to Australian standards. It'll be to the, you know, the tougher restriction of Australian or international standards on key points. But I think it comes back to, you know, industry knowledge of what's going on and getting that learning from past projects where things have gone wrong, and making sure that the next contract really does specify that tightly so that you don't get a situation where something that's not going to be fit for purpose is within the contract allowance.
I would like to add that there is no country in the world which have a perfect standard describing the particular type of things which we are now building, because they didn't exist in that scale 10, 20 years ago. And definitely there is a gap between the development of the standard for particular application. If we're speaking about foundation perspective, we rely on maybe on 5 or 10 different standards, and the interpretation which one should be more prioritized in a particular case is I would say state of art decision. And it's, I would say, not the only Australian case. It's a similar challenge meeting in everywhere in Europe as well.
Thanks, Andre. I think that might be it. We're going to bite into people's lunch session and networking sessions. I'd like to thank Rob, Andre, Katrina, Julian, and Rob Seek for an informative panel. Hopefully, audience have got some good value out of that and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.